Hello and welcome everyone. Another day, another apologetics response video. There's actually been quite a lot of activity in the apologetics and counter-apologetics space recently, and among the videos and topics and issues that have come up is this one Kalam documentary that was released, I don't know, about a month ago now by this channel that I'm actually not familiar with, but probably should be. What's their channel name here? Skydivephil. I want to give all credit to them. They seem to do a mixture of philosophy and like physics videos, so I think worth checking out. But this video was released, about a month ago, which presents a number of physicists and philosophers replying to the Kalam cosmological argument. And I haven't seen this video. I thought it would be interesting to provide a live reaction and commentary to it. And as I've sort of indicated in the title of this stream, something I also want to do, which I have done in a previous live react before, is try to predict what I think Craig will say in response to this video. Now, I noticed that Craig's already released part one of his apparently 4-part response to this video. I haven't watched that, and I probably won't until all 4 parts come out. I'd like to wait until a response or an argument is complete before responding to it. It seems kind of pointless to respond halfway through because, they might say something about something that, you were going to say something about. So I'll wait until that comes up, and maybe I'll do a BA with Nathan on that or something. But having said that, I haven't seen any of Craig's response, so I don't know what he will say, but I like to think that I know a fair bit about how Craig thinks about the Kalam, having read a very large proportion of his work on the topic. And if you want to know more about that, you can check out my book, Unreasonable Faith, where I discuss the Kalam in great detail. Anyway, so this video is going to be a review and commentary on this video, and also so I'll share some of my own thoughts and try to predict about what I think perhaps Craig could or would be likely to say in response. So as I said, I haven't seen this video before, so this will be a live react. We'll see how we go.
Creation stories of Pacific Islanders tell us the world was made from a volcano. Other origin myths say the world came from water. But contemporary science tells us that the world evolved from a Big Bang. And the outdated view that this marks an absolute beginning has been used by religious philosophers, most notably William Lane Craig, to revive an old argument for God known as the Kalam Cosmological argument. In this film, we'll hear why this argument fails from the very cosmologists quoted by Kalam's supporters. And we'll also hear from leading philosophers of mathematics who will show why the concept of an infinite universe, now being proposed by many physicists, is perfectly coherent. And lastly, we'll see that if the universe did begin, it may not need a cause. The argument is often expressed like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause, and that cause is taken to be God. Let's start.
So that's the classic formulation that Craig gives there. I don't know if they're going to talk about the identity of the cause, like whether that is God. But the formulation that they gave there in terms of where they said that cause is taken to be God, I feel like that is opening up an avenue for Craig to object that he doesn't just take that cause to be God. He gives arguments for why that cause has to be God. Although I will say that Craig does spend most of his time arguing for the just the conclusion that the universe began to exist, and a relatively small amount of time arguing for why it has to be God. But just that formulation there worried me a little bit. I guess that is their initial summary. So that's probably just how they frame that. We'll see how we go here.
At the beginning, philosophers like Craig have argued that the past must be finite.
If the universe never began to exist, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions.
As we shall see, contemporary mathematicians do not think infinity is contradictory, although it's true that philosophers of the past were troubled by it. But even they did not banish the concept. For example, Aristotle distinguished between different types of infinity.
The distinction that he was drawing was between an infinity that's present all at once, all at some particular point in time, which is what he meant by an actual infinity, contrasted with an infinity that is spread out over time, which is what he called a potential infinity. So, for example, if space were infinitely big, that would be an example of an actual infinity because the whole of space is there at any given point in time. On the other hand, if you imagine a clock endlessly ticking, the ticks might go on forever, but if they did, that would be an example of a potential infinity.
But in the 19th century, Georg Cantor revolutionized the mathematics of...
So I'll just comment on that. So Craig is fine with potential infinities because he thinks the future is potentially infinite, or the number of future events is potentially infinite. That is, it can increase without bound. But he argues that if the If the universe didn't have a beginning, then the past would have to be an actual infinite. That is, an actually infinite number of past events would have had to have elapsed by the present, and that's what Craig argues is impossible. So I don't think anything there is necessarily a problem for Craig.
The infinite.
What Cantor achieved was to treat infinity as a subject of mathematics itself.
It was a whole new branch of mathematics, and it was of breathtaking ingenuity, showed incredible craftsmanship and creativity on Cantor's part.
What Cantor showed was that an infinite set has a strange feature. We might call this the infinite property. That is, it can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with a subset of itself.
We can pair the even numbers up with all the numbers, all the counting numbers altogether. So 2 gets matched with 1, 4 gets matched with 2, 6 gets matched with 3, 8 gets matched with 4, etc., etc.
So, for instance, you can show that there are just as many even numbers as there are counting numbers, when intuition should tell you that there are half as many.
Well, okay, so this just is counterintuitive, and it's counterintuitive because we're used to dealing with finite sets, and what we have to say in the case of finite sets just doesn't carry over to the case of infinite sets. But it doesn't follow that there's anything incoherent about what we say in the infinite case. It just follows that we have to start saying different things in the infinite case.
What you get from most mathematicians, I would say almost all mathematicians, is an uncritical acceptance of infinity in the sense of actual infinity. That's what they need for doing the kind of mathematics that they do.
So one of the first things that mathematicians come to appreciate is that infinite collections do have different properties from finite collections. Things that we absolutely take for granted in the finite case simply don't carry over to the infinite case. And if it's the finite case that is providing us with our basic intuitions, then that means that some of the results about infinite sets are going to be counterintuitive. But that's just what you would expect. Why should the finite and the infinite be the same? As long as we're prepared for these differences, again, the very worst that it will be is counterintuitive. It won't be contradictory. It won't be inconsistent.
So one way to...
The production quality for this is very high and consistent. It looks like that they have like professionally filmed all of these interviews specifically for this video, which is pretty impressive. You don't normally see this the resources available for this sort of, which effectively counter apologetics. So that's I don't know. It's refreshing and interesting to see. But anyway, to the point here. So what Craig is going. So everything they've said I agree with so far. But what Craig is going to say is that, yeah, sure. So mathematicians use infinity, and mathematical results from Cantor's arithmetic show the counterintuitive properties of infinity. And Craig's going to argue that it's precisely these characteristics which mean that you can't have actual infinities in the real world, that infinities are these sort of fictions or these ideas that you can think up and describe mathematically, but can't exist in reality. So my prediction is that what Craig will say about these sort of remarks is that supports his argument that you can't have real actual infinities of like real events or amount of matter or something like that. Because of the counterintuitive properties which can exist in a sort of a fictional mathematical realm, but not in a not for anything real. I think I don't know that directly implies, but it certainly fits nicely with Craig's anti-realism about mathematics. So he rejects mathematical Platonism. So he doesn't think that there's any mathematical objects that exist sort of outside or separately from the universe that mathematical discourse refers to. That could potentially be an objection to Craig's attitude about mathematical discourse like being fictional, but because he's not a Platonist about mathematical objects or discourse, then that's not an issue for him. So yeah, I think this is a good start. We'll see where we get to.
Bring out the difference between the finite and the infinite is to think about somebody counting. So imagine George is counting to 10 and he's got as far as 5. How many numbers has he got left to count? Oh, he's got 5 numbers left to count, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But now imagine George is going to count all of the numbers, every single counting number. He's got up as far as 5. How many numbers has he got left to count? He's got infinitely many numbers still left to count. What about when he gets to 10? How many numbers has he got left to count? He's still got infinitely many numbers left to count. So his task isn't going down over time. But when he's counting a finite set, his task is going down over time.
One classic example that Craig has given to show infinity cannot exist is that of Hilbert's infinite hotel.
The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which...
All right, can we see the problem here, everyone? What's the big problem with what we're looking at now? I'll give you a moment to think. So maybe I'll turn these off for a moment. Do you see here? They're showing the YouTube video. And it's in light mode. Like, who watches YouTube in light mode? It's 2022, people. Come on, it's ridiculous. Anyway, let's. I just couldn't let that go.
Are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem. Then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out.
It seems Craig is claiming infinity is problematic because the Hilbert Hotel is both full and able to admit new guests. But the problem may simply be the way full is being defined.
If what we mean by full is every room is occupied, then that's true, but it doesn't prohibit us being able to accommodate new guests because we can shuffle them all up right in an infinite hotel. If what we mean by full is can't accommodate new guests, then it's just false that it's full.
In Craig's video, a contradiction is supposedly found by considering what happens when the guests leave the infinite hotel.
Suppose all the guests in the odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel, and yet there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left, and yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out.
So these animations are from the philosophical Kalam video that Craig, I think they just released that last year or something. For some reason, there was like an 8-year gap between when they released the scientific evidence one, you know, these animated videos, and the philosophical arguments one, which I think is odd. So Nathan and I have reviewed the scientific arguments one, but I haven't actually seen this one before. The arguments are all the same, of course, but it's yeah, I haven't. The animations are quite slick. Although, what's the deal with this tree here? You see, these trees look kind of normal in this one as well, but this one looks squashed. Like what? It's like someone just resized it like super lazily. But I don't. And this one looks kind of fat too. I don't know if that's a style that I don't know. It just why is the tree's like on a diet or something? Anyway, let's keep playing here.
Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers.
The trouble.
Okay. So I'm reacting. Hang on. I assume that the philosopher is going to say this here. So this is false, right? I mean, I suppose if I'm generous, I would say this is highly misleading, but I'm tempted to say this is just false, right? One of the reasons for is because subtraction is not defined for infinite magnitudes, so you can't actually subtract. I think, and Craig's usually more careful than that, right? What he'd say is he would use non-mathematical language. He would say, like, if you remove this subset of people, then you'll get an infinite left over. But if you remove this other subset, then you've got a finite, 3 left over, which is true. But the thing is, there's no contradiction there. So I we'll see if they discuss this. I described this in my book. It's quite well understood mathematically. So the operation that's being performed here, if I recall correctly, is called the relative complement. And what it means is that you have 2 sets and you take away part of that set. You can always ask, and you'll always get an answer to what is the size or cardinality of the set that's remaining. So when you're dealing with finite sets, like 5 sets of 5 things and sets of 3 things. If I take away 3 things from 5 things, I'm left with a set of 2 things. The cardinality of that set is 2. So the size of the relative complement and the answer of subtraction are always the same for finite sets. But for infinite sets, they're not. Because subtraction isn't defined for infinite sets. So that's actually the issue here. If you try to define subtraction for infinite sets, you get contradictory results, which is maybe the best faith interpretation or Steelmaniist version of what they're saying here. But what they haven't said is that subtraction isn't defined for infinite sets because you get contradictories and contradictory results. You can't define subtraction, but you can always define a relative complement, which means that whatever set you take away, you can always ask, well, how big is the set that's left? So if you take away all of the even numbers, well, then the set that's left is still infinitely large. Whereas if you take away all of the numbers larger than, well, are we starting at 1 or 0? I'm not sure. But if you take away all the numbers larger than 3, then you're left with 3 left if you start at 0. Now, in both cases, you've taken away a set that's infinitely large, but the subset, the complement set that's left has different sizes. That's how infinity works, right? Infinity makes it so that this relative complement and subtraction actually aren't, they diverge. For finite sets, they're always the same, but not for infinite sets. Now, I'm not saying they should have put all that detail in this video, but what they shouldn't have said this, right? Because this is just wrong, because subtraction just isn't defined. But there's no, see, what Craig argues is that this shows that you can't have actual infinities because in reality, well, you could potentially take away infinitely many guests. But the thing is, there's no contradiction there. The only contradiction arises with the operation of subtraction. But you never have the operation of subtraction in the real world. All you have in the real world is actually taking away or adding specific sets of people, or hypothetically, I guess, including infinite sets in this thought experiment. There's no contradiction in that, right? We can describe that mathematically completely fine. It's just if you want to start to talk about subtraction, then that becomes a problem. Again, it's counterintuitive because it doesn't work that way. In finite, it's the same, right? But I think that this is actually wrong here. Let's see what the philosophers have to say about this.
Prediction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers.
The trouble, that video is so below threshold. The complaint in that that clip, in particular, the one that says that if there are only 3 people left, then there's still the same number of people have checked out as were there originally. That is a feature of infinity that has to be taken on board very importantly, which is that any finite initial segment of an infinite set, if it's linearly ordered, is such that what's left is infinite. So no matter how far you go, in fact, you're still leaving infinitely many elements ahead of you.
There's a formal theory of arithmetic, which is characterized by the Peano axioms. And that's a language where you can express any sentence of arithmetic, like 7 + 3 = 10 or something. But when it comes to this Cantorian transfinite arithmetic, there's just no notion of subtraction. It's not well defined to say infinity minus 3. That's not a sentence of either the Peano arithmetic or the Cantorian arithmetic. So while someone might say it informally, there's no formal language where that really makes any sense.
One of the strange things that Cantor showed was there are infinities of different size. The first
Yeah, so what they say, of course, there is correct. But I think, see, Craig's going to say something like what, so Trent's given a response to this as well. Again, apparently only part 1s. I don't like reviewing part 1s of things. I like to review a whole thing. So I may get to those in future. But apparently in that review of this same video, Trent has said that, and this is basically what Craig says, there's no one to slap your hand and stop you from subtracting. So the argument here is that in arithmetic, we get around in like Cantor's arithmetic, we get around the problem of subtractions being undefined by just sort of banning subtraction, like not allowing it. But so Craig says, in reality, you can take things away. So that shows that in reality, you couldn't have these infinite sets because if you because of the contradictions that would, or absurdities that would entail, right? Now the problem with that, which I don't think was drawn out in these in those little interview snippets there, is that transfinite arithmetic allows us to precisely describe the size of any set resulting from removing any set from something else. So to take Craig's 2 examples, if you take all of the even numbered people out of the hotel, we can describe precisely the size of the set of people that is left. It's infinite in that case. Now, if we take away everyone numbered 3 and above, there'll be we can also precisely describe the size of the set of people who will remain. There'll be 3 if we start at 0. Now, in both of those cases, we've removed a set of size infinity, but we've left over with a set that is different sizes. As I said before, that's a bit weird because finite sets, it doesn't work like that. If you start with something of one size and take away something of the same size, you can't end up with different sizes, but you can with infinities. That's just how it works. Now, the point is all of that can be described perfectly well and concisely, precisely rather, using infinite set theory. The only thing you can't do is subtraction, but you don't need to do subtraction for this thought experiment that Craig is imagining here. So Craig is just, and Trent are just wrong if they say that there's any implication about an impossibility of this occurring in reality. There's no result that says that there has to be an answer to any subtraction question that you ask. All there would have to be, if there were an infinite hotel, is an answer to the question, how many people are left in the hotel when you remove an infinite number of guests? And there always will be, and you can always describe that mathematically. It's just you won't use the operation of subtraction because it's not defined in this case. So the notion of the no one slapping your hand to prevent you to subtracting is just completely misconstrued. It misunderstands the relationship between subtraction and infinite sets and the notion of the relative complement. And I'm going to refer again to my book here, Unreasonable Faith, where I discuss this in more detail, and also credit the source where I read about this. Because I don't know why more people haven't called Craig up on this, because it's basically just wrong what he says about this. Anyway.
First infinity is known as Aleph.
Oh, yeah. So before we jump there, so that's what Craig's going to say about this part. He's going to say, yeah, that's all fine, but the thing is, in reality, no one prevents you from subtracting. There's no one slaps your hand, something like that. And he's going to say that that's precisely why actual infinities are possible. So the response that we should make to that is to say, Craig, yes, that's not really a problem, though, for actual infinities, because we have this notion of relative complement, which describes everything you're concerned about perfectly fine, and therefore means that there's no absurdity. The only thing we can't do is use the operation of subtraction, but we don't need to, so no problem.
The next largest is Aleph 1, and so on.
So there's this infinite number which is called Aleph 7. And there's also an infinite number which is called Aleph 5. And we can add those. And if we add Aleph 7 to Aleph 5, you might think that what we're going to get is Aleph 12. But it doesn't work like that. The infinite case is different from the finite case. In fact, what happens if you add two infinite numbers together is that the bigger one swallows up the littler one. The smaller one is insignificant compared with the bigger one. And Aleph 7 plus Aleph 5 is just Aleph 7. Aleph 7 just takes over, and it's as if the Aleph 5 wasn't even there. So Aleph 7 plus Aleph 5 is Aleph 7. And similarly, Aleph 7 plus Aleph 3 is Aleph 7. If you add these smaller infinite numbers to Aleph 7, you just get Aleph 7. Now, suppose we tried to perform a subtraction. Suppose we start with Aleph 7 and ask, what is it that you need to add to Aleph 7 to get Aleph 7? Now, unfortunately, there's no clear answer to this, because we saw that if we added Aleph 3, that would just give us Aleph 7. If we added Aleph 5, that would give us Aleph 7. There's no longer any such thing as the number that we need to add to Aleph 7 to get Aleph 7. And this is an example of how subtraction just isn't well defined in the infinite case.
You could say the same about zero, that 0 divided by 0 isn't defined. In fact, anything divided by 0 isn't defined in normal arithmetic. But that doesn't mean division is meaningless or that 0 is contradictory.
As we saw earlier, when presenting to a lay audience, Craig has claimed.
Yeah, so those are that's a good explanation of how subtraction, or of why subtraction isn't defined, because there's no unique answer to what you have to add to a number to get a resultant number, because it's just refer back to literally what he just said there. He used different sizes of infinity to illustrate the point, but it also applies to infinity compared to like Aleph naught, the cardinality of the natural numbers, compared to finite numbers. Again, the issue is that I don't think they've made the connection to what Craig is arguing, which is that because of these, Craig's going to say that it's precisely because of these properties that you can't have actual infinites, right? Because in the real world, you can take things away, and subtraction sort of would be possible. So my prediction is that Craig is going to say that this supports his argument, and where I think Craig is wrong about that is misunderstanding the relationship between subtraction and taking a relative complement, which is what Craig is always actually talking about in the real world. Because in the real world, you can't actually do subtraction, right? You can only take away a specific subset of things. We often call that subtraction, but that's us confusing. I would say it's us confusing map with territory. It's confusing our mental models of arithmetic with the actual things in the world. And in finite cases, it doesn't matter because they're always sort of equivalent. But in infinite cases, it does matter. This is an interesting question. Have I seen the video where Craig claims Jesus experienced an actual infinite of punishment? No, I haven't. I feel like Craig could get around that by saying that it's a qualitative rather than a quantitative infinite. That is something that I've heard before. Don't ask me what that means, though. But I've heard people say that, so maybe that's what he would respond, but I don't know. Anyway, let's keep going with this.
That the infinite is contradictory.
But mathematicians recognize that the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to self-contradictions.
But when talking to philosophers, a different claim is made.
Now, Alex is certainly right that when we appeal to these absurdities, we are not talking about logical contradictions or incoherences. Jose Bernardet, in his book on infinity, says that there's no logical contradiction involved in these monstrosities, but you have only to look at them in their concrete reality to see that this is metaphysically impossible.
In contrast to other notions of possibility, metaphysical possibility is far less clear what the definition of that is supposed to be. And many of us are dubious that just simply pointing that something seems absurd is enough to forbid it from existing. In reality, philosophers have to be a lot bolder than that, a lot more open-minded.
Hotel case is so basic that that's no place for anybody to dig in their heels against infinity. Even if you only accept potential infinity, the Hilbert Hotel and those results about it are completely incontrovertible.
The examples that are supposed to be problematic always involve admitting new guests, shuffling guests from one room to the other. And if we imagine a hotel where the doors were sealed and nobody could move from one room to the other, it's hard to think of a similar example that could bring out anything that looked absurd about it. It would just be a hotel with infinitely many rooms in. And if that's right, it does lead you to wonder whether the problem is the infinity involved or whether it's the manipulation of those infinite elements that's the problem. And that's helpful because, I mean, it's plausible to suppose that what's done is done and you can't change that. The past is fixed and unchangeable. So that if the past is supposed to be like an infinite hotel, then it's more like one where the guests can't shuffle around than one where they're free to move to different rooms. I mean, it's just impossible that yesterday didn't happen, given that it has happened.
Another example given.
I don't know if I'm interrupting them in the middle of a point there, but yeah, so this is a point that's, of course, discussed beautifully in my book, but yeah, of course, I'm borrowing from other philosophers who've discussed this as well, that the Hilbert Hotel case doesn't seem that important to, or it seems that it's not that relevant to Craig because as Malpass just pointed out there, most of the absurdities relate to moving guests around or admitting them or discharging them. You don't discharge guests from a hotel, do you? I've forgotten. But what's the word you use? Anyway, I'm getting distracted. But none of those things are relevant for the series of past events, which is fixed and can't change. So from what I recall, Craig has responded to this by saying that although you can't move around the ordering or change the number of past events, what you can do is you can mentally shuffle them around. And that this, trying to remember exactly what he says here. He says something like this provides a way for thinking about how the absurdities would still apply, even though you can't move the past events around, because you can mentally shuffle them around. As is maybe coming across in my tone, I don't really understand that response, because the fact that, I mean, you can mentally shuffle anything around. I don't know what significance that has for the sort of metaphysical possibility. Because I'm going by memory, I may have slightly misremembered precisely what Craig says, but he definitely appeals to the idea of mental shuffling, which just doesn't seem like a relevant response to me. So I feel that that's a bit desperate. But that is because I've read Craig talk about that. Perhaps he will raise that as a response here as well. The other move that I would expect him to make is to appeal to other absurdities which don't appeal to sort of mentally shuffling or anything like this. And in fact, it seems that that's the direction we're going, because Jupiter and Saturn, it looks like they may be moving to talk about one of the other thought experiments that he gives, which is of two planets that are orbiting the sun or orbiting each other. I think there's different versions of it, and doing that from infinity past. So the ratio of their orbits becomes infinity, but then it seems like that one should have orbited infinitely more than the other one, but because infinity is like the two infinities are the same size, they've also orbited the same number of times, right? Because infinity and infinity are just infinity, and so this is supposed to be an absurd result. So that's one of the examples that doesn't require this sort of shuffling of events, and there are others that Craig gives as well. The Tristram-Shandy paradox is another one of those. I don't know if they will discuss that in this video, but anyway, the point is that the other move that I would expect Craig to make is to say, look, Hilbert's Hotel is kind of a warm-up. It's to get you thinking about the some of the issues with infinities, but the real argument comes with some of these other thought experiments. So that's my prediction of sort of what he's going to say there. He, of course, won't use the word warm-up, right? He wouldn't, he doesn't concede that much, right? But anyway, let's see where we're going from now.
And to try and refute infinity are the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn.
Suppose that for every one orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes two.
Yeah, here we go.
The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these two planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbits? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. That seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes.
If they were always orbiting, then there is no notion of one being at any given point having gone twice as many times as the other. That just doesn't make sense.
The hypothesis is not that they start orbiting at some point in time and then become zero orbits at that point. But if the hypothesis is that they've always been orbiting, then it's just the case that they've both always done infinitely many orbits. There's no sense in which you could draw a graph that they start at zero and then diverge away from each other and then one of them catches up or something. They're just both always having done infinitely many.
Infinity is accepted by mathematicians.
Wrong button. Sorry. Yeah, so this is another example of this video just being wrong, I think. The animated video. Now, where is it?
For the longer they orbit.
Here, right? So, again, I would say this is just wrong, right? The reason it's wrong is because there seems to be a 0 point. Well, no, there doesn't seem. This is a 0 point, right? Because the vertical axis is the number of revolutions, and they both start at the same point, which is 0. Now, that's impossible. Like that's logically contradictory with the hypothesis that they've both been revolving or orbiting from infinity past. Like it's impossible for there to have ever been a time where they had the same number of orbits. So this is just inconsistent with the very hypothesis that they're making. Now, of course, they're going to say, look, this is just an illustration, but it's a fundamentally misleading and I would say dishonest illustration, because I don't know how you could put this in the video and not realize this is just a lie. Like the scenario prohibits it from being possible there was ever a time when they had the same number namely 0 revolutions, because it's supposed to be from infinity past. So this graph makes no sense at all. And if it's graphs like this, and remember the other one where we saw the two different infinities and the contradiction coming from it, if these sort of visualizations are trying to be used to persuade people of the strength of the Kalam, then I would say that that's extremely misleading. And look, let me be controversial here. People have criticized me in the past for claiming that William Lane Craig is at times, not always, at times intellectually dishonest. I haven't I've not like done a video where I try to go through the main reasons I have for that, but I do mention it occasionally when I think it's relevant. This is a time when I think it's relevant, right? These two visualizations here are fundamentally misleading and basically just factually wrong. And I don't expect that Craig oversaw the production of this video, in detail, but surely he signed off on it, right? And it has his name, so I don't absolve him of responsibility here. I don't see how anyone can defend this graph being used in defense of the argument that is being used in defense of, because the graph contradicts everything that's stated in the thought experiment, namely that they'd be orbiting for an infinite amount of time. So this is the sort of reason why I say that at times Craig is not intellectually honest, because I just don't see how you can defend this sort of thing. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, but the whole putting that graph aside, the argument about the planet revolutions, just as was said here, I mean, it's just the case that they've always orbited the same number of times, and it's always been that they both orbited infinitely many times. Craig contends that that's just absurd, or I forget exactly what other words he used. He likes absurd. I mean, at that point, we can only say, well, maybe Craig finds it such, but there's no contradiction there, and it's not obvious what the problem is supposed to be. That's just how it would work if they'd exist for an infinite amount of time. I don't think Craig has much of an argument there other than an appeal to his intuition that couldn't be the case. I'm getting some comments here about how we can, some of these are very creative, how we can save the y-axis here. Digital Gnosis says the axis aren't labeled. Well, the x-axis is labeled as time, and the far left is at the point in time where the vertical axis converges. So there is no such point in time, right? So that's already a problem. But also the graph is titled revolutions, and so I think it's very reasonable to interpret that as representing the vertical axis. Now we've also got the hypothesis here that the vertical axis is actually transformed through arctan or some other operation, which I suppose you could hypothetically say that, yeah, there's actually a transformation here that means that they actually never convert. I suppose that's possible, but that really seems to be reaching here. I don't know that these are not taken entirely seriously. I maintain that this graph is basically just deceptive, not just like kind of bad, but like just deliberately deceptive or negligently deceptive. But either way, it's kind of bad. Anyway, let's move on.
Of one being at any given point having gone twice as many times as the other. That just doesn't make sense.
The hypothesis is not that they start orbiting at some point in time and then become zero orbit when one of them catches up or something. They're just both always having done infinitely many.
Infinity is accepted by mathematicians. So what about physicists?
So in regards to infinities in physics, the only obstruction that we have is an observer cannot measure an infinite number, because infinity is not a number. Things that are observable cannot be infinite, but things like the entire volume of a space or the entire duration of time can be infinite as long as an observer cannot measure them.
Roger, why don't you start with the absurdity of a Hilbert hotel? That you can't.
It's not an absurdity. It's just what happens if you have infinity. I mean, that was the major thing that Cantor had showed. You can talk about infinity in a serious way, and you deduce very powerful results from talking about infinity in the right way. You have to be careful when you talk about infinity, but yes, if you're careful, talking about infinity is perfectly reasonable. So I can't see a general statement about infinity is not physics.
I think what Roger's probably thinking is what I would think is that there's certainly a well-defined mathematical description that one can imagine where there's some function that's defined for all time that describes what's happening at all time, maybe a wave function that evolves with time and is defined for all time. And how did we get to now question really just doesn't arise. At the time T0 that we call now, the wave function says that certain things are happening. And if that's an accurate description, that's what's happening. One doesn't have to start at the beginning at minus infinity and go through all the times to get to now. One is just here, now.
Craig claims that the infinite past is impossible because one can't reach infinity by successive addition, which is true if you only have a finite amount of time. But what if you have an infinite amount of time? Could you count all the numbers then?
Yes, if you're counting forever, if you're never finishing, there is a sense in which you can count them all. And it's the following sense. Given any individual counting number, however big, 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion, you'll eventually get there. It doesn't mean that you ever will reach the point that you can stop and say, done it, I've now finished, I've counted all the infinite numbers. That never happens. However far into the future you go, you've still got infinitely many numbers still to count. So no, this isn't a task that ever terminates, but we didn't claim that it did. The claim was only that you can count infinitely many numbers in an infinite amount of time.
Okay, so sometimes the problem is supposed to be that we can't transition from the finite to the infinite. After all, if we've got something finite and we add a finite amount to it, then the result's going to be finite. So no matter how many times we do that, we're never going to break out from the finite to the infinite. The problem is not so much that that's false, and it seems to me that that's true. It's just that the hypothesis of the past having no beginning is such that it's always been infinite. There's never been any point in the past where there'd only ever been finitely many. So there's no need for a transition.
So you never.
Yeah, so that point there is, I think, extremely critical. And Craig, I think, is not entirely consistent in the language that he uses to talk about this, because, and we've seen this, I think, in discussions he's had with Malpass before, that he still likes to use language that implies some sort of transition from finite to infinite, like counting up to infinity, or counting down from infinity, like to the present, is a phrase that he uses. Now, that doesn't make any sense. You can't count down from infinity or up to infinity. But Craig, and so Craig's right about that, but he still uses that language in quite a lot of his talks and writing as well, to describe what would he thinks would need to happen if the past were infinite. In fact, as Malpass just said there, all that would follow from that is that the number of past events would always be infinite. But as the guy before him had said, I don't remember his name, that for any point in the past, the distance between that, well, he didn't say it quite this way, but it follows from what he said. For any point in the past, or any event in the past, the distance in time between that point and the present is finite. So there is no past event that is an infinite temporal duration from the present. So every past event has a finite elapse of time between that and the present. This is assuming the past was there's an infinite past, right? So there's no problem in transitioning the interval between any past event and the present, because that's always finite. And there's also no problem about counting down sort of from infinity, because there's no sense in which there's ever a point at which we the past events have been elapsed. That there have always been and always will be, assuming I guess unless the universe goes out of existence, but otherwise there always has been and always will be infinitely many past events. But between any particular past event and the present, the duration between that is finite. And when you realize that, most of these sort of alleged contradictions or paradoxes, I think, dissolve, or at least become a lot clearer, because most of them rely on a confusion of those 2 points about the duration in time between a particular past event and the present, and the length of time, or the duration of all past events, which is always infinite. You never transition between, as Malpass said, you never transition between finite and infinite, or vice versa, infinite to finite. But you don't need that in order to make sense of an infinite past. So the way to describe this is that if the past were infinite, it would be the case that the past always has been infinite. The number of past events has always been infinite. However, the time that's elapsed between any particular event in the past and the present is finite. And that's the sense in which you can count infinitely many numbers. It's like for any temporal distance, a year, 10 years, 1,000 years, 1 billion years, 1 trillion years, you can always sort of, if you like, mentally trace back in time, or trace forwards in time, if you like, from that past event to the present, and you'll get a correspondence there. Like there'll be some events that amount of time ago. So you can trace that up to infinity, to a potential infinity, right? There's no limit to how far you can trace back in time different past events. There's no contradiction there. That all just follows. And so I think that Craig's, a lot of the problems that he tries to allude to or describe arise from him not making this distinction. So in terms of how he would respond to this, it's a little unclear, because honestly, I feel like that Craig is not always clear himself about this sort of distinction. But probably, I wonder if at this point he would appeal to the Tristram-Shandy paradox, which is, I don't really want to describe that here if they don't go into it. But it's basically the idea of someone who is writing his autobiography and takes a year to write every day, if I recall correctly. And the question is whether he will finish or when he will finish. And it gets into the whole issue of ratios of infinities. It's sort of similar to the paradox of the planets, orbiting at different rates. But it seems that one infinite should be like bigger than the other, but then they're technically the same. Again, I talk about this more in my book. And I'm trying to remember. I think Oppie's written about this as well. So there's interesting work on that, but I don't know if they're going to go into that here. I feel like that's maybe where Craig would go in response here, and what he would want to do is try to explain how it's impossible. What he says is that it's impossible to finish an infinite count. Craig says that if the past was infinite, then what you would have to have is this idea of someone counting down, like not that there would be a specific person, like that it would be as if someone was counting down from infinity past and then at the present reach 3, 2, 1, 0. We're done. Craig says that would have to follow. And obviously that's absurd. It doesn't make any sense because you can't transition from infinite to finite, as Malpass said. So therefore you can't have, you can't transition through an actual infinite, according to Craig. Now, what I would say is that so that's what I would expect Craig to emphasize as his response to this. And I think the mistake that Craig is making there is to assume that that's what's necessary for the present to elapse, to have sort of transitioned through a count down from infinity. It's just sort of unclear where that idea comes from, because it doesn't come from the structure of there being an infinite past. All you need for an infinite past is for time to be such that for every event in the past there is an event before that. Or I mean, it depends how you define event, right? But you can think of it as a time when something could have happened, even if there was nothing to happen, right? That's all you need for an infinite past. You don't need this idea that there's been some sort of something that's been elapsing down from the infinity, counting down to the present. That just, there is no such thing, and it doesn't make sense for there to be a such thing. But Craig sort of insists that there would have to be. I think this comes down to his intuition about. I mean, it might relate to his presentism. I'm not exactly sure why he sort of seems to be so wedded to this idea. I think that one way he describes it is in terms of like, well, why is it the present now instead of it being like 1,000 years ago or something? And he seems to have this idea that, well, there's some sort of, I don't know, like metaphysical counter or something that has reached zero just at the point of the present, like, and that's why it's now, so to speak. I want to clarify that Craig hasn't articulated it that way. That's me trying to make sense of what Craig says. And I just think this idea of trying to ask like, why is it now or something, just is a pretty much a meaningless question, because that question is indexed to whatever events that you're simultaneous with, right? So anyone in it throughout all of history could ask why it's now, and it would have the same sort of content there. Anyway, so getting a bit distracted there, but the point is, what I would expect Craig to respond to this is by sort of digging in about that idea that would have to sort of count down from infinity to zero. And maybe he would mention Tristram Shandy in response. And my response to that is just to say that I think that Craig's idea about what would have to, that would be necessary in some way, or that would be entailed by an infinite past, is just wrong, that there's no reason to think that would be the case. And it just doesn't follow from an infinite past. It doesn't make sense. All that you require is that for every past event, there was an event before that. And that's a perfectly coherent concept, right? It's always been the case that there have been infinitely many events, but for any particular past event, there's a finite duration between that event and the present. And then there's no need to elapse any infinite distances, right? Because from any past event, you can say, well, the distance elapsed between that event and the present was finite, so there's no problem there. The only problem is if you imagine an infinitely distant past event and imagine trying to get from there to the present, then there's a problem. But there are no infinitely distant events. This is the other issue that I think Craig misunderstands. The fact that the set of past events is infinite, it doesn't follow that there is a past event, that there is any past event that is infinitely temporally removed from the present. Every single past event has a finite temporal distance from the present. And so you can elapse that distance from that past event to the present. That's just a weird fact of infinities, that you can have an infinite set of things, but every member of that set has a finite distance from the present. And so there's just no contradiction there. But Craig seems to think that there just has to be because of this idea of elapsing. But I just think Craig's wrong about that. And I don't think he's been able to persuasively articulate, I mean, not to me or other philosophers, I think, as to why we have to think about it in the way that he does.
You get to the end of this process, you never get to the last biggest counting number. This is a sequence. The sequence of counting numbers is a sequence without an end, but that's perfectly acceptable. That makes perfectly good sense. The fact that you can't get to the end is indicative of the fact that there is no end.
Suppose we agree the infinite is impossible. What does that mean for the infinite future? Supporters of the Kalam are generally committed to this idea, not just because religious texts seem to promise it, but also because some allege that our lives have no meaning without it.
That on a naturalistic worldview, everything is ultimately destined to destruction in the heat death of the universe.
Oh, before we get to this cringe, so people, hang on, it's disappeared. Yeah, so a few people mentioned this. I mentioned this at the start, but I'll just repeat it now. So I've seen that Craig has come out with the first response podcast of apparently a series of 4. I have not seen it, and I won't go through any of them until they're all out, because I like to review things when they're finished. So here I'm predicting what I think Craig might say in the course of those 4. just because I think it's interesting and a way of understanding other arguments and kind of giving my preemptive response to that. Yeah, so I'm also seeing one or two people in chat kind of saying the same sort of stuff that Craig always says, that only potential infinities are real and they can't be actualized. All I would say is that this whole video is me talking about those ideas. So let's keep going then.
Our moral lives become vacuous because they don't have that kind of cosmic significance.
I still need to have you explain that for me better, because again, it seems to me it's one thing to say it lacks eternal, cosmic, everlasting significance. It's another thing to say it lacks significance. In fact, to give one of your examples, you talked about, again, I remember the source of this quote, but the torturers, was it Nazi torturers?
Right, yeah.
You say, if theism isn't true, then it doesn't really matter. This strikes me as, I'm sorry, I'm sure it's going to sound rude, but it strikes me as an outrageous thing to suggest it doesn't really matter. Surely it matters to the torture victims whether they're being tortured. It doesn't require that this makes some cosmic difference to the eternal significance of the universe for it to matter whether a human being is tortured. It matters to them, it matters to their family, it matters to us. So again, how do you move from the lack of eternal significance to the thought that if it doesn't have eternal significance, it can't have any significance?
Because the victim, it obviously matters to him in the sense that he's in pain and agony, but ultimately it doesn't matter that he was ever in pain and in agony. The whole thing just degenerates into utter meaninglessness and insignificance.
It's hard to see how someone can claim that infinity is incoherent and then state that our lives are meaningless unless they are eternal.
Yeah, I don't think that's a good argument, because Craig doesn't say the notion of infinity is incoherent. What he says is that it's impossible for there to be an actual infinite. And he's been criticized about this with respect to the idea of whether there are true facts now about I've got to be careful here, whether it is presently the case that there are true tensed facts about the future, specifically the infinite future. So one way of asking this question is, does God now know how many praises Craig will sing to him in heaven? According to Craig, does God know this? And I've watched some dialogue where Craig discusses this and read some of what he said about this. I think that Craig is very slippery on this, and he keeps sort of weaseling or missing the distinction between whether it will ever be the case that Craig has said infinitely many praises, which is false, right? There will never be a time when Craig has said infinitely many praises. This is just the mirror of what I was saying about the past. Just as there is no point in the past, supposing the past and the future are both infinite, right? Just for illustration, there is no point in the past, there is no event in the past that is a infinite temporal removed from the present. Likewise, there's no event in the future that is infinitely far from the present. So there will never come a time, or there never will have elapsed a time when Craig will have sung infinitely many praises to God, right? So Craig is correct in saying that. But the question that's pressed, and I feel like Craig just sort of weasels out of this, at least in my opinion, is, does God currently know, or is there a fact of the matter about the tensed fact of how many praises Craig will sing, right? Because there is currently, certainly according to Craig, a fact of the matter about the number of events that have elapsed in the past. Craig claims that the number of events that have elapsed must be finite, whereas I think it could be infinite. I'm not sure. I think actually it's probably finite, but I'm open to it being infinite. Likewise, I'm also open to the idea that the number of future events could be infinite. And it seems that Craig has to say that the number of future events will be infinite because he believes in an eternal heaven, right? But and that seems to then open up an inconsistency between the fact that Craig is willing to admit an infinite future but not an infinite past. Craig claims that there's no contradiction here, because what he says is that there have, if supposing the past are infinite, there would have elapsed an infinite number of past events, but there never will have elapsed an infinite number of future events. Now, Craig is, it gets into a language game, which is you can maybe see how it gets tricky here. So I'll say that again and try to listen carefully to the tense here. Okay, so supposing the future and past are both infinite for the moment. So what Craig says is that, so if the past were infinite, then now it must be the case that there has elapsed infinitely many events. So that is true. Craig's right about that, if the past were infinite. Craig also says that there never will be a time in the future when there will have elapsed infinitely many events between now and then. Like, there never will be a time when Craig will have sung infinitely many praises to God. Right? So that is true. Craig is correct in both of those claims. The thing is that isn't the problem. The problem is how many, notice that we're switching tense here, we're moving to future tense. How many praises will Craig sing to God in heaven. Not how many will he have at some point in the future, but how many now will he sing? And it seems that the only answer there can be is infinitely. So what we see here is a symmetry. It is now the case that there have been infinitely many events in the past, if the past is infinite, and according to Craig, it is now the case that there will be there will now be infinitely many events in the future. It is presently now the case that the number of events that will elapse in the future is infinite, right? So there's a symmetry between those. And it seems that that's a problem for Craig because he wants to admit an infinite future, but not an infinite past. Craig will say that the past is an actual infinite, the future is a potential infinite. And that's how he'll try to get around this. But I just think he's wrong there because of the tensed logic that is sort of essential because he's a presentist, right? So he believes in the sort of metaphysical reality of tensed facts. So there's an objective sense in which whether something is present or past or future. So I think Craig has to admit that if there's a problem with there being an infinite number of past tensed facts now, then there should also be a problem with there being an infinite number of future tensed facts. I'm not sure why only the past is problematic, but the future is not. If anyone can get Craig to kind of actually bite on that issue in a conversation, I'd be very interested because every time that I've seen it, he weasels out by conflating the claim that there never will elapse a time when there are Craig has sung infinitely many praises, which is true, with how many praises Craig will sing, which seems that there should be infinitely many, and which represents a problem for Craig. Anyway, so that's all a bit of an excursus to say that I think Craig does have a problem with the notion of infinity and how he applies it. But to say that Craig thinks, which was just stated in the video here, that Craig thinks infinity is, they said, contradictory or something to that effect, I think is wrong, because what Craig's going to say, it's just actual infinites that can't exist in reality. So I predict that he's going to react strongly to this and say that people are misrepresenting him. But as I said, I think that Craig does have a problem with infinities, particular his trying to distinguish future infinities from past infinities in a way that I don't think makes sense. Anyway, let's keep going.
After all, the infinite future seems to have remarkably similar properties to an infinite hotel.
If you think about the number of events in the future as like equivalent to the number of guests in the hotel, and then as time passes, we're removing an event from the future and putting it in the present. And we can ask how many events are there left in the future. It's the same number of events in the future as there were before that event entered the present. So even though we've taken one away, we've got the same number left. And that's exactly the same property. It's adding one guest and having the same number of guests after adding it in. So if one of them is problematic, so is the other.
If the idea of infinity is putting pressure on the idea of an infinite past, then it's going to put equal pressure on the idea of an infinite future. There's no clear asymmetry there that means that one of those is problematical in a way in which the other isn't.
Craig's response to this problem is to suggest that an infinite past would be actual, but the infinite future would only be potential.
So it looks like I jumped the gun a bit there. This is just all what they're going through. Let's see how they cover this, but also a couple of clarifications from chat. So Greg did say contradiction. I don't know a non-logical way of understanding contradiction. I'd have to review the exact clip, but what I would say is that Craig is usually careful in what he says. He may have been being sloppy in a particular clip, but one should be cautious as to whether he was saying actual infinities, because what he would say is an actual infinity is contradictory. And when he says actual there, he means like in reality, like metaphysically real, not just in sort of mathematics logic land, which remember he doesn't take to be real. He takes that as some sort of nominal or fictional reading. So if he puts the adjective actual in front of infinity, whatever he says about that is referring to infinities like in reality. And so if he says actual infinities are contradictory, then still maybe that's a bit sloppy, because I think what he should say is that they're metaphysically impossible, although we like saying they're absurd, which is a vague claim. But anyway, I just wanted to clarify that when you're criticizing Craig, you need to be very, very careful, because otherwise in his counter response, he's going to pick apart what you said and why you misrepresented him and how silly and wrong you are. Of course, he won't use that language, but that's the sort of tone you'll get. I've seen this before. So for Craig, it's the distinction between actual infinities and potential infinities, or sort of theoretical infinities in mathematics land, is very important. And so you have to check as to whether he's talking about one versus the other. Anyway, so that's where we're up to now. So Craig tries to get around this asymmetry, this apparent symmetry between the infinite past and infinite future by appealing to the difference between actual infinities and potential infinities, saying, and Craig says that the past is an actual infinite, or would be if it could be infinite, right? Which is impossible or absurd. Whereas the future is only a potential infinite, and that's allowed. So that's how Craig gets around this. And as I've said, I don't think that works because of this shift in tense that Craig uses when he's talking about these, which I actually don't. Well, no, I didn't get into that, but I think Craig is just sort of sloppy about this, or doesn't sort of realize the importance of that tensed language there. But we will see what Malpass and others have to say about this.
It seems to me that this rests on a mistake, because Craig, instead of focusing on the question, how many future events will there be if the future is endless, to which the answer is infinitely many, Craig instead switches to how many future events will have been. And that, it's true, is always finite and increasing over time and approaching infinity, but never getting there. But its problem is that those two things are compatible with each other. And for one thing, it's changing the subject. If you say how many events will there be, and to answer in terms of how many events there will have been, it's changing the subject. But also, they're both true. I mean, even though there will have been finitely many events, it's also true that there will be infinitely many events. In the infinite future, those two are not incompatible with each other.
The infinite future is not the only.
Okay, so that's pretty much exactly what I just said, and put more concisely. But so the issue here is that I would be very impressed if Craig responded directly to that, because he and Malpass had a discussion about this, and Craig, I feel like, just kept muddying and just kept going back to conflating those two, or not distinguishing between them appropriately, when the distinction is absolutely vital to the whole point that's being made. It's not a verbal trick. It's actually really significant, because Craig is the one who is making a big deal out of tense being like metaphysically significant. Like there's an objective metaphysical fact of the matter about whether something is past versus present versus future. So tense language really matters here, especially when we're talking about infinities and infinite sets and so forth. So the other point, though, is that what Malpass just said there is, while I completely agree with it and it's completely correct, it's an example, how to put this? It's an example of, I don't want to say it's bad, because I don't know that I could do any better, but it's not convincing, is all I'm trying to say. It's not convincing to people who are kind of already on Craig's side. I'm raising this as sort of a meta point about discourse, right? Because that point there about the difference between whether there will elapse an infinitely many events and whether there will be a point where there will have elapsed infinitely many sounds like a verbal trick that will just pass most people by. And that will just seem like it won't make any sense, or it will just seem nitpick or something. And then Craig will say that Malpass is wrong, and whether Craig addresses the point or not, many people are going to sort of believe what Craig says there. And so this is a problem, I think, that when we get into the weeds so much, where we basically completely lose the ability for most people to sort of follow what's being said. And here it's not even really a question of jargon. There's not a lot of jargon here, so it's just about paying really careful attention to the language, and in particular the tense here. So I guess this is just a general, I mean, I'm not saying this only happens to one side or the other. This can happen to Christians responding to atheists and atheists responding to Christians. But this is a point where you if you think that this argument should be taken seriously one way or the other, you really need to pay careful attention to these sorts of points, right? Like the subtleties of this. Yeah, I think that this is a real just a stickler of discussions like this when it comes to points like that we just have to be really careful, and often that sort of passes people by. So that's just a general sort of exhortation for people to be careful if they're again, from whichever side, when we're sort of trying to think about these things carefully.
Only infinity supporters of the Kalam tend to embrace. They've also claimed that the Big Bang singularity proves a beginning of time.
Rides at a state of infinite density.
Oh, hang on. So we just had a transition here. So now we're moving to talk about the scientific evidence for the beginning, I assume. Actually, it occurs to me that there are timestamps here, so I can sort of peek ahead at what's happening. I'm just interested. Okay, so they do talk a bit about causation. That's interesting. We'll come to that. Craig these days spends more of his time talking about the scientific arguments than he does about the philosophical, which again is interesting. Not entirely sure why that's the case, because Craig thinks that the philosophical arguments are sufficient, but whatever. With respect to the philosophical arguments, now the Tristram-Shandy paradox wasn't discussed. I am going to guess that Craig will probably mention it in his response. I don't know whether he's going to, in his debate, Craig will explicitly point out any arguments that he raises that are not responded to, which can be a problematic tactic. I say can be because in one sense, it's okay to mention the fact that if your opponent hasn't responded to something. But the problem with what Craig does is he often raises so many points that it would be impossible for the opponent to respond meaningfully to all of them. And then pointing out that that the opponent hasn't done that is, I think, a little disingenuous, or at least it's an instance of, I think, rhetoric being used for to mislead rather than to augment good points. But anyway, so I don't know whether Craig will say something similar in this. Obviously, this isn't like a live debate, whether he's going to say, well, they didn't even respond to my strongest point, which is Tristram Shandy. I think there are a few others, but I think Tristram Shandy is the one that he most appeals to. They did indirectly talk about it, because it's the whole issue about the fact as to whether, when I was talking about, the idea of having to count down from infinity effectively. That's what Tristram Shandy's more or less getting at. There's sort of variance there. Again, I'm not going to go into the details here because it wasn't discussed here, but my prediction is that might come up in Craig's response. Another thing that could come up, although I'm guessing probably not, but that may be relevant, is the what's it called? I've forgotten the name of it. The Grim Reaper paradox. That's the one. So this comes up. This has been brought to prominence a little bit recently by some videos that Cameron from Capturing Christianity has, where he's defended this in his debate with Rationality Rules. Now, Craig himself, I won't really get into what the paradox is if those who don't know, but I just want to raise it here because it could come up in what Craig says in response. It's a different thought experiment which attempts to show the absurdity of an actual infinite, essentially. Craig doesn't appeal to it actually in his writings because he doesn't think that time is structured like the real numbers. He thinks that the idea that you could divide time up infinitely, sort of finely, it doesn't make sense, and that's what the Grim Reaper paradox appeals to. So I don't know if that would come up in his response at all. It might, to make a point, but we will see. I'm going to guess it probably doesn't, though. Anyway, so I think that, sort of to summarize the philosophical section, I think the points made were really good. Unfortunately, I think that there are still areas where Craig can and will respond. So just to summarize, I think what he's going to say is that he's going to dig in about the distinction between actual and potential infinities. He's going to say that the counterintuitive aspects of infinities that were discussed by some of the philosophers there are exactly why he says that actual infinities are possible. He's going to say that the Hilbert Hotel is sort of like a starting point, and that the real strong arguments against the possibility of an actual infinite past are like the Tristram Shandy and the revolution ones, maybe some others as well he may mention, and relating to the idea of sort of transitioning or transversing through an infinite set to the present. And he's going to respond to the point about the infinite future by just reiterating the difference between an actual and potential. And I think he's going to make the same, what I regard as a mistake and what Malpass regards as a mistake about conflating the tense issue there. I'd be very happy to be proven wrong about that if he actually directly addresses that on point. But Malpass has discussed this with him, like in a direct like a Zoom chat, and Craig sort of just didn't kind of bite on that. So I don't expect him to do so here. I also expect him to react negatively to some of the points where you could argue that they strawmanned him, or at least weren't as charitable, like when they said that Craig said that infinities are contradictory or something. Craig's going to say that he's only talking about actual infinities and, points like that. So we'll see if my predictions are correct. Let's now move to the scientific side of the evidence, which looks like is a bit more than half of the video, and see what we have to say there.
At some point in the finite past. This state represents a singularity at which space-time curvature, along with temperature, pressure, and density, becomes infinite. It therefore constitutes an edge or boundary to space-time itself.
The argument by Lane Craig that the fact that there's that the infinite past is impossible, and therefore that conception of the universe is untenable, is incompatible with their claim that there is a singular point at which the universe originates, because the properties of that singularity are entirely infinite.
Precisely what a singularity is, as John Barrow has forcefully emphasized, is something that involves a kind of actual infinity. For physical reasons, involves a kind of actual infinity. And this is precisely what these very same thinkers said that they were suspicious of. So to put it very bluntly and very crudely, are they trying to have their cake and eat it, accepting an actual infinity in one context while trying to dismiss it and being suspicious of it in another context?
Mathematicians do not think infinity is contradictory. What may be contradictory is claiming that infinity is both a contradiction and not a contradiction. Claiming that the infinite past is incoherent when the infinite future is embraced. And claiming that the beginning of time is confirmed by the Big Bang singularity, which itself involves infinities.
Yeah, they kind of put that Big Bang part in the philosophical part, which I think is a little weird. But anyway, that's a minor point. Yeah, so again, Craig has said so many things about this that it's quite plausible that he's not always quite precise. So usually he's fairly careful, unless he sort of deliberately doesn't want to be. And by that I mean instances like when he's making his moral argument, where he's very uncareful, I think, in a lot of the claims he makes. But anyway, that's a topic for another video. So regarding the singularity point, what Craig has said, at least in other places, is that he regards, or / you can regard, the initial singularity as sort of a boundary. Like there's no actual singularity. It's just sort of, if you go far back enough, you can model it as a singularity, but that's not really a singularity. And in fact, I think that that's the standard view in physics, is that singularities are suspicious, and we don't think that there are actual singularities, but they represent a kind of a boundary, or an idealization if you extrapolated sort of back to that point. Yeah, I don't actually think that Craig is committed to the existence of singularities one way or the other. What he wants to do is appeal to the evidence from science that the universe is temporally bounded in the earlier than direction, which I think is the more sort of precise way to say that. I assume that we're going to get to the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or the Guth-Born-Vilenkin theorem. I've seen all, I think, permutations of the three names there, which is one of my favorite things to criticize Craig about, because of how he abuses that. We'll see whether that comes up. I mean, I actually don't know that they're going to make this point, because I think that, I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn here, but I think I am actually the first person to have at least sort of published publicly to criticize Craig in appealing to the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem on the basis of the fact that it contradicts his philosophical writings about his attitude toward infinity, his attitude towards the past, and his attitude towards philosophy of time, because he publishes those in kind of separate literatures, and I haven't found anyone who's specifically made the links that I do in my book here. So we'll see if any of the philosophers here kind of raise that issue, or the issue is that they'll get philosophers to respond to the philosophy side and scientists to respond to the science side, whereas actually the issue is that there's a contradiction, or there's actually a bunch of them, I think, between Craig's philosophical arguments and his scientific arguments that he appeals to. But we'll see where we go.
A further problem for the Kalam argument is that it assumes an eternal universe would have had to traverse infinite time in order to get to a unique now. But in relativity, there is no such notion. Time is relative.
Yeah, so sorry, just that statement there. So that's what Craig claims, that if the past were infinite, then the universe or time would have had to have transversed through an infinite duration to get to the present, and that's the basis of what he says is absurd. And that notion is actually absurd, right? You can't transverse an infinite duration and start with sort of being infinitely far and end up with it at the present. It doesn't make sense, because there's no Aleph naught and other infinite magnitudes have no successors. So you can't count up or down from them. It doesn't make sense. As I've said before, and as was discussed in this video by some of the philosophers here, you don't need that to have an infinite past, and there's no reason why I think that you would expect that an infinite past should work like that. And certainly, and this leads to the point now where we're talking about relativity, that's not how time is treated in relativity. So I guess we'll expand on that here.
In order to tackle this, Craig appeals to what is known as the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of relativity, which does restore a unique sense of now.
Discovery with Copernicus is that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Well, but you can always rethink the Earth as you can imagine that you can add a center. Nobody prevents you from doing that. You just complicate life for yourself. And it's the same for special relativity. You can add a preferred reference frame. It's not visible, it's not detectable, but you think it's there. That's the Lorentzian, the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity. What do we gain? The only thing we gain is that we can do the new physics with old mindset. But I think we should adapt our intuition to the new physics, not adapt new physics to our intuition, right? When we discover that the Earth is round, that's up, that's down, but if you're in Sydney, it's the other way around. Or you can think, yeah, but in reality, there's a true up and a true down. You can, but what do you gain? I mean, you have to adapt your intuition about that down to the discovery, not the other way around. Physicists are not particularly keen about Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of special relativity. Having said that when you go to general relativity, have a Neo-Lorentzian interpretation is much harder, because in special relativity, you just pick a frame and in general relativity, there is no global frame. I think everything in physics, monophysics is telling us there's no preferred frame, there is no preferred time slice, there's no preferred time.
Craig has suggested there is a universal clock that gives us a unique now. That is cosmological time, the time since the Big Bang.
Cosmic time is the same for every hypothetical observer in the universe, regardless of his state of motion. In other words, cosmic time is a kind of reinstatement of Newton's absolute time.
Well, cosmological time is a fake. Why?
So I got to be a little bit critical of the video here. Nothing that they've said I disagree with. I just think they're moving too fast, and they're going to lose people, right? So I know I paused it a little bit, so maybe that cut up the flow. But I don't think that. I think what we needed is a little bit more of a clear explanation about the fact that, like Newton and I guess pre-Einstein, basically everyone thought that there was an objective notion of time in the sense that there was a past and the future and the present, and that time sort of flowed and was sort of the same everywhere. I mean, we sort of speak metaphorically about time speeding up and slowing down, but there was an idea of an objective present and an objective past, and that was the same for all observers. Now, that changed with Einstein, who introduced first special and then general relativity, which did away with the idea of there being a unique present, or even an objective notion of simultaneity. So again, in Newton's vision of the world, you could always say objectively whether two events were simultaneous with each other, or one was before the other, or vice versa. In Einstein's view of the world, that's no longer true. Whether two events are simultaneous or the ordering of them depends on your reference frame. Now, the reason this is a problem, which again, I don't think was, I mean, maybe they'll get to this. I think they maybe should have said this a little earlier. The reason this is a problem for Craig is because Craig's a presentist, and a presentist says that the only thing that exists is what is present. But then you have to sort of decide, well, what's present, right? And you don't want to say that, well, what's present depends on your reference frame. You want to construct a set of events that are simultaneous with each other, and that objectively is present. It doesn't really make sense to say that that's relativized to your reference frame, unless you want to like massively relativize your ontology. And Craig, I'm pretty sure, doesn't want to do that. So therefore, there is a problem with special relativity and Craig's presentism, or his philosophy of time. To get around this problem, Craig appeals to a specific interpretation of special relativity, which is known as the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation. It's a fairly old view that's not really discussed much, even in the philosophical literature. That there's a little bit on this. I think a lot of it by Craig, actually. And it's even less popular in science, which is what this gentleman was just saying before. One of the reasons it's not popular is because it just seems ad hoc. It basically says, well, there is an objective reference frame, that there's one particular reference frame that's the true present, and the others are just kind of I forget exactly how it goes, but the others are sort of that there's some sort of force that causes their observations to be affected such that they observe things differently, but they're actually wrong, right? There's a true frame that's the correct frame. Now, the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, to my knowledge, cannot, at least in special relativity, cannot be falsified because it predicts the same observations. It's just more complicated. It adds more structure to the world than is needed. At least that's what physicists how they regard it. That's how I would regard it as well. So it's not very popular. Now, what I would expect Craig to say in response is what he said in one of his, I forget what it's called. He wrote a whole book on the relationship between relativity and time. And what he says is that the current orthodox interpretation of special relativity is based ultimately on Einstein's way of thinking about it, which was fundamentally positivist. Basically, what Einstein said is if you can't measure a difference or detect it in any way, then it doesn't exist. And Craig says that's nonsense, right? And we've rejected this, and we've moved past this sort of positivist view, back with the collapse of logical positivism in the 60s or whenever that happened. And that now we should be more sort of willing to embrace the idea that there can be facts of the world that we can't necessarily detect, but could still be true. He goes on and on about this over hundreds of, in my opinion, rather dry pages. So I expect he may appeal to that here. Now, that doesn't by itself support the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation. It's more of a criticism of the prevailing interpretation, which basically says that if you can't measure a difference in any, like, even in principle, you can't measure any difference between different frames of reference, then there is no objective frame of reference. Craig wants to critique that idea, and wants to say that, in fact, it's quite plausible that there could be an objective frame of reference. And then that links to what he says about the cosmic time, which is the idea that actually this provides an objective frame of reference for everyone. Now, this is another instance where I would say that Craig is just wrong about this. Cosmic time is no such thing. And I'll let this gentleman explain. He'll probably do it far better than I can.
It's a kind of reinstatement of Newton's absolute time.
Well, cosmological time is a fake. Why? Because matter, gravity slows time. So inside the galaxy, clocks go slower than outside. The point is there are many different clocks in the universe, which they don't agree with one another, and there are many times in the universe which don't agree with one another. The idea of the cosmological time is just one arbitrary definition of an average, but I can give a different definition of an average.
What about cosmology?
Yeah, so as David says here, cosmological time, so I think it's called cosmic time. Cosmological time is how it's usually described. Yeah, cosmological time is a fake is a bad way to say it, but the gist is right. Yes, I agree. So again, Craig is going to jump on that, I think, because it's not fake, right? That this white is killing my eyes.
Doesn't the Big Bang imply the universe had a beginning?
Oh, that's better. Yeah, so cosmological time is the way that the operationalization of the age of the universe that's typically used in cosmology, right? Now, again, this is stretching my memory here. If I recall correctly, cosmological time is defined to be the age of a trajectory, or the temporal sort of duration of a trajectory measured along a frame of reference that's co-moving with the expansion of the universe, or something like that. I may not have gotten that quite right. The point is that that's a very convenient frame of reference to use when measuring time in cosmology, right? Because we're interested in the expansion of the universe. That's in fact, you can actually describe time purely in terms of the scale parameter, or the scale constant, or I forget the exact name of it. It's been a few years since I did this, so forgive me if some of the details are a bit fuzzy, because I didn't know exactly what they get into in this video. But the point is, because the way we study the development of the universe is so connected to its expansion, we can we have this formula for flipping between them, and that's essentially what cosmological time does. It's a way to get time out of the expansion of the universe. So it's defined in a way that is in that reference frame that's co-moving with the expansion of the universe. So it's extremely useful in cosmology. What it is not is an objective reference frame. It's just a reference frame. Like, it's a useful one to use in cosmology, but it's not more like true or something, or more metaphysically significant or whatever than any other reference frame. And that's what the gentleman there was expressing. Now, I don't know exactly what Craig was saying in response. I think that he is just going to double down and say, well, actually, cosmological time is used everywhere, and maybe he'll appeal to papers or quote. He likes to appeal to quotes. So he's probably going to give quotes from physicists talking about cosmological time and imply that that it provides the basis for an objective reference frame, because this is what he says in his books. But Craig is just wrong about this. There's no connection between cosmological time and objective reference frame. They have nothing whatever to do with each other, as I discuss in my book. I apologize for shilling my book, but it's just that obviously I can articulate things a bit more clearly and go into a bit more detail there. And I do discuss most of these issues there. So if you are interested, check that out. But the other issue is that we haven't really dealt with general relativity, because general relativity, I think, well, this was mentioned briefly. General relativity basically kills off the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, because to my knowledge, it's just impossible to reconcile that with general relativity, which relates relates time to the curvature of space-time, which is sort of connected together, and also to the mass energy that exists in the universe. As I discuss in my book, I think that there's no cogent way to make sense of presentism under, or at least Craig's version of presentism, under general relativity, unless you just think that general relativity doesn't actually describe the world. It's just like a useful fiction, effectively, that is predictively useful, but doesn't actually describe the way reality is. Because according to Craig, what's present is just what exists. The present is a moment of time that's elapsed from the past, which then goes out of existence, and then there's an objective set of things that exist now, then that will elapse into the future. That's what present is, right? Time is this sort of very distinct metaphysical, I guess, process of coming into being and going out of being. In general relativity, time is a dimension just like space, which is extended throughout a four-dimensional block that is space-time, the universe. And time is affected, like the other dimensions of space-time, by the matter and energy that's in space. So, I mean, it would seem to follow that somehow this process of coming into and going out of being is somehow like bent by the matter that's in space-time in 4 dimensions, even though only one like 3-dimensional spatial slice of that exists at any time. I contend that it just doesn't make any sense at all. I've not found any what I regard as very cogent response to this by Craig. I think mostly what he just does is appeal to the idea of cosmological time, which, as I say, has nothing to do with presentism or the idea of an objective reference frame. The other thing that I've heard him appeal to is the idea of now there is an attempt to try to fit general relativity, or at least parts of it, with some sort of presentist metaphysics. I can't remember the name. I think they call it a spatial hyperplane or something. It's basically taking like a slice of that 4-dimensional space-time block that represents a surface that is interpreted as being an objective present. You can do that, but then there's preferred foliation. That's what it's called. It's called a preferred foliation. And so you can sort of break up the 4D space-time into these infinite, there's another problem, but set of foliations, right? Each of which is sort of present. but the problem is, again, that's ad hoc. There's no evidence that there's any preferred foliation, and even some formulations would would make it impossible that there's a preferred foliation, depending on the exact structure of space-time, because it's curved, right? But even aside from that issue, there's just the issue of like, well, but how does what is objectively present like bend time? I don't think it makes sense conceptually under presentism, but it makes perfect sense under the standard interpretation of general relativity, which is that time is not this sort of separate ontological process. It's just basically another dimension of space-time, and can be described using all the mathematics of general relativity. So I think Craig has a really tough time making sense of general relativity with his presentism. I think that we got a little bit of that here, but I feel like that Craig's going to get around that by just doubling down on the cosmological time, and maybe he'll even talk about preferred foliations. I don't know, but he doesn't usually talk about that very much. So we will see. But some of these may come up a bit more in the video. So let's keep going.
The Penrose-Hawking singularity theorems that supposedly prove this have assumptions that almost nobody in cosmology takes seriously anymore. In particular, most physicists think Einstein's theory of gravity will need to be modified to take into account quantum or other effects that arise in the extreme conditions of the Big Bang. This isn't just the consensus of cosmologists, but the views of the very authors of the singularity theorems, Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking.
The real lesson of the singularity theorems is therefore that we need to combine the general theory of relativity with quantum theory in order to understand the origin of the universe.
It is certainly a view quite commonly expressed now that we shouldn't simply give up that the Big Bang is a singularity, that we need a theory which describes that. Most people would say it's a form of quantum gravity. I have a view which is different from that, but nevertheless, I have in common with that we need a new theory.
I don't think anybody believes that the universe started off with a singularity. That just tells us that Einstein's classical theory of general relativity breaks down. So that classical theory of gravity doesn't apply when you get to very high energies. So it's replaced by some quantum theory, consistent quantum theory of gravity. String theory is a candidate.
Standard Big Bang cosmology, which was a hot Big Bang, right? You start with a very hot, dense universe, and which begins at singularity. So that picture, I don't think anybody believes.
Many scientists have taken our best candidates for a quantum theory of gravity and analyzed the Big Bang. Models inspired from string theory often show that the Big Bang...
All right, so this is the stuff that Craig seems to like to talk about a lot these days, the different theories of the beginning. So again, I feel like there's a bit of context missing here. So they did sort of say this, but I just don't know that it came across as clearly as I would like to present it to a popular audience. Not that this video is necessarily aimed at a popular audience, but anyway, I'll try to do my best to clarify it a little bit. So what the Big Bang Theory says is that the universe is currently expanding, getting bigger, and it has been doing that for some number of billions of years, 13.7 or whatever, I think is the latest estimate. But the point is, we can trace that back in time. And what we find is if we go back far enough, there was a time, again, about, call it 14 billion years ago, when the universe was all collapsed down to one very small, very hot, very dense, very energetic state. And if you trace it all the way back, you actually get to a singularity where it's all collapsed like to an infinitesimal point. And that's called the Big Bang, where everything emerges from that and expands outwards, right? The term Big Bang, incidentally, was a derogatory term that was used by opponents of the theory because they thought it was silly. So, but it's sort of stuck. But anyway, so that's the idea, right? But the point that was being made by those physicists there is that no one, I mean, I don't really know, even if at the time, but certainly no one these days thinks that the Big Bang was actually this singularity where everything was like infinitely dense and then it expanded out from there. The idea is simply that if you go back far enough, and when I say go back, I mean consider the earlier and earlier universes, things get smaller and smaller and more condensed. At some point there, you're going to transition into a realm where our current theories don't apply anymore. And this moves you into the realm of quantum gravity, where you need to introduce quantum effects to make sense of what was happening. And our current theories don't do that, right? They're not, quantum mechanics and general relativity cannot be, or at least we don't currently know how to integrate them fully into the same theory. Most of the time, that's not a problem because quantum is about the very small and gravity usually is only relevant to the very big. But when you get to the very early parts of the times of the universe, then both are relevant. It's both very small and, in a sense, very big, at least in terms of very energetic, right? Very massive. So you need both, but we don't have a theory that can do both at the same time. There are candidates like loop quantum gravity and string theory and others, right? But they're not empirically determined. They're not empirically supported, and there's still theoretical issues that are worked out that need to be worked out. So the point is, what scientists would currently say is that the current universe began about 13.7 billion years ago, and that's where everything emerged from. In terms of whether that was an absolute beginning, we don't know, because we don't know what happened at before sort of the boundary where we can't cross in terms of when our current theories break down. And that's when we start entering into quantum gravity, which is really speculative and is not not established by current science. So what Craig argues, and he has discussed this in length in, for example, the Blackwell Companion article, which Nathan and I looked at, I think last year in one of our bad apologetics videos, and he's also discussed in some of his debates, is different classes of models that have been suggested of the development of the early universe that would allow the universe to be past infinite. One of them is shown on screen here, the big bounce, which is the idea that the Big Bang sort of into the present is sort of mirrored into the past by another Big Bang that sort of is projected in the past direction. That would be kind of a model of a collapsing and then an expanding universe again. There are other models as well, which I imagine we'll probably look at some of them more in the course of the video. But basically the point is what Craig wants to do is say that, okay, there are these different models of universe that would, of the origin of the universe that would allow it to be past infinite. What he does is he looks at those models and he thinks that none of them work for various reasons. That whole approach of someone who's not a physicist assessing these models, which are cutting edge physics and cosmology and are not agreed on by the experts, and then deciding whether they are acceptable or not, I think is kind of ridiculous, really. Even if you're a physicist, I don't think you should be doing that, because the correct answer is don't know. But anyway, Craig is sort of happy to do that and say that, no, we can at least reasonably rule out these models, and all we're left with is a model that actually occurred. Sorry, a model of an actual beginning of finite time in the past, which is what Craig wants to establish. So anyway, that's the context here, where basically we're moving beyond the Big Bang theory. It says Big Bang doesn't tell us everything; it only tells us that the current universe emerged from a very hot, dense state. But what happened before that, we don't really know. But we're pretty sure it wasn't a literal singularity. There was something else that was happening, but we're not sure what it was.
It was not the beginning. And a frequent result is that there was a contracting era that preceded our expanding universe.
There had been an evolution of the universe, which was some kind of mirror image of what happened afterwards. So in the same way as the post-Big Bang era where we live, in our model, will last forever, and I think it also lasts forever in ordinary inflation, okay? For us, because of this symmetry, this duality, also the past is infinite, okay? The future and the past are both infinitely long.
String theory's main rival, loop quantum gravity, seems to show the same thing.
If you reverse the film, so to say, of the evolution of the universe and went back in time, the universe was contracting. And then instead of reaching a zero volume, in fact, when it reached the curvature became Planckian, then new quantum effects come into the picture, and they cause the universe to bounce.
Any theory that has some kind of discrete space, then by definition there, you don't hit the singularity. That could be an explanation of why all these models they somehow go to this bouncing solution when we arrive at the very small scale.
With the physics community abandoning its belief in the applicability of the Penrose-Hawking theorem, Kalam advocates switched to a newer theorem, known as the Bordich-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV.
Here it is, boys. I promised it would come. I won't bother talking about the Penrose theorem. That's Craig does discuss this, but the BGV or the BVG or whichever order you give it, this is the one that Craig likes to present. So I'll try not to preempt and just sort of play what they have to say, but we will see.
This theorem was developed because the period of rapid expansion, known as inflation, that's believed to have taken place in the early universe, violates one of the assumptions of the Penrose-Hawking theorem, that gravity is always attractive. Inflation is also thought to be eternal into the future, creating an infinite multiverse.
In 2003, Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the very early universe. So in fact, the Board-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does imply an absolute beginning of the universe.
I was working with Arvin Borda and Alex Vilenkin to understand what we can learn about how inflation might have started and how far back it could have gone. And in particular, once we realized that inflation could be eternal into the future, it seemed like a very natural question to ask. Could inflation have also been eternal into the past? And what we found was that inflation could not be eternal into the past. What we basically managed to achieve was proving a theorem which says that any expanding region of space-time that has a minimum expansion rate can only go back so far and not infinitely far. So that means that inflation must have had a beginning. It doesn't really say that the universe must have had a beginning, but it says that the universe could not have been expanding forever up until the present time.
So we interviewed Ashtekar, and in their model they have a bouncing universe, and say, well, that means the universe could be eternal in the past, and that theorem doesn't prevent that. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right.
The theorem proves that inflation must have a beginning, right? The universe as a whole. The theorem doesn't say that. It says that the expansion of the universe must have a beginning, right? So, but it opens the door somewhat for alternatives.
As we've seen, one way to avoid the BGV is to have a past contracting universe, which is also a common prediction in multiple approaches to quantum gravity. But some suggest that this collapsing phase will be messy and unstable, and therefore not be able to transition to our smooth, homogeneous universe.
We have absolutely no idea of what exists in the universe before the bounce. So it's very speculative and very difficult to decide whether the situation is stable or not. And even in the case where the situation is unstable, usually what it means is that the simplifications we use in standard cosmology cannot be used anymore. But nature doesn't care about the fact that it is hard to calculate. So when we say that something doesn't work, most of the time it means that the model we use to describe these things doesn't work anymore. For example, you cannot use the Friedman equation because the universe is so inhomogeneous that the Friedman equation is not usable anymore. So what? The universe doesn't care that we have to invent another equation. I think the correct way to think is not to go from the past to the future, is to start from what we know. What we know is what we see around us today. The universe is expanding. We have stars, we have galaxies, we have gravity. We have a theory. And then we go backward in time and we see what happened. And in our theory, when we go backward in time, we do not end up with a singularity. We end up with a bounce.
The BGV theorem relies on principles of relativity. For example, signals cannot travel faster than light. But this is problematic for Craig's Lorentzian relativity, which allows for faster than light travel. And with the authors of the BGV explicitly stating it does not prove the universe had a beginning, the Kalam advocates have begun using yet another theorem developed by Aaron Wall.
Wall is assuming that some version of second law of thermodynamics is really fundamental and should be a fundamental ingredient in the series, which determine whether they.
I'm going to pause it there. I just wanted to finish out the BGV section. I think it's a little hard to follow some of these. Well, we're getting back to Valenkin again, maybe not. Anyway, so let's make some comments on this. So first of all, it seems that they're not raising the objection that I raise, which is unfortunate, but I wouldn't necessarily expect to be in this sort of august company. But I think it's a very good point. And the point is this, that Craig, and again, we haven't actually touched on this at all in this video, which I think is a weakness that allows Craig to get away from a lot of criticism that he should be facing, which is Craig's philosophy of time. I've mentioned this earlier. Craig is a presentist. He thinks that all that exists is the present, or what is present. In fact, what he says is that what is present is simply, to be present is simply to exist temporally. Now, as I also indicated, this doesn't really fit with how physicists certainly think about time in the context of general relativity or the origins of the universe or anything, because we, in general relativity, time is bound up with the three dimensions of space to form space-time. Sometimes talk about space-time manifolds. And all of the calculations that are done are in terms of the length of trajectories through space-time manifolds. And so already, and this is one of the criticisms I raised in my book, already it's not clear what relevance any of these calculations have for Craig's contention that metaphysical time, that is the coming into being and going out of being of successions of events, must have been finite. Craig actually says that, and I quote him in my book, I won't pull out those quotes now, but you can have a look there if you want to see the quotes, where Craig actually says that he thinks that physical time is not the same as metaphysical time. That is, that the physical time that physicists are using when they're constructing their theories and calculating trajectories and so forth, that's sort of an abstraction that's useful for prediction, but it's not the same as metaphysical time, which is what Craig's talking about when he's talking about the origin and the fact that the metaphysical time must have been past. The time must have had an absolute beginning, right? He's talking about metaphysical time, and he explicitly says that the fact that that physical time may not have had a beginning or may have had a beginning doesn't have any implications for metaphysical time, because they're just different things. And clearly they must be, right, because they're described using completely different models. Craig's presentist understanding of time just has no relationship to the way that time is discussed or modeled in general relativity or in current physics. So the point is, by Craig's own light, he cannot use the Borg-Dirichlet-Lenken theorem to make any claim, any philosophical claim about the origin of the universe, not the metaphysical origin of time, at least. This, I think, becomes clearer if you actually read the paper. Let me just jump back a little bit. I strongly recommend those who have, I would say, sorry, I'm just trying to find where it actually shows pulled up the paper here. For anyone who has high school calculus, I would recommend, and obviously you're interested in this stuff, pulling the paper, because it's very short, and although it's sort of dense, it's not actually that difficult. Now, of course, I can't find it where they've actually shown the front of it there, but it's called it's called inflationary. If inflationary universes cannot be passed, inflationary universes are passed incomplete, or something like that, or cannot be passed incomplete. And basically, what the paper consists in is a series of, if I recall, 2 calculations under 2 different assumptions. I can't remember exactly what the 2 assumptions are. And what it shows is that when you integrate over a line that extends backwards in the past under the assumption of inflation, remember that was critical, what you find is that this integral is always finite, which means that the distance back in time is always finite in inflationary models, in models where on average the universe is inflating, which means its expansion is accelerating. That's a whole other issue which we won't get into here. But so the reason why that's important is because when you kind of understand what the paper is actually saying, it's literally performing an integral over trajectories in this 4-dimensional space-time and showing that they're finite. When you then read what Craig says about what time is, like presentism, and what he says about the relationship between physical time and metaphysical time, I claim that there is just no way that you can take seriously the idea that the Borde-Griffith-Lenken theorem has any bearing whatever on Craig's notion of metaphysical time, because they're just 2 completely different conceptions. And Craig himself says that the beginning of one doesn't entail the beginning of the other, that they're separate things. Physical time is just sort of operational, and it's an abstraction, and it's not real in the same way that metaphysical time is. So I think Craig wants to eat his cake and have it too here. He wants to be able to appeal to the results of these physical theorems, while also holding to a set of philosophical views and interpretations that are inconsistent with those theorems, or at least inconsistent with a realist interpretation of those theorems. Of course, he can always adopt an instrumentalist interpretation, which I think effectively is what he does. But then you can't appeal to those theorems to establish philosophical conclusions, right? They can't sometimes be instrumental only, and then sometimes be realistic, like describing the actual way the universe really is. That's just cherry picking. So that's my major objection to Craig on the BGV point. But the other point that was mentioned in the video here is that the fact that what the BGV theorem is, even putting the philosophy of time issue aside, it just establishes that the inflationary relativistic universe had a beginning. It doesn't follow that all of time or all of space-time, well, I should be careful there. It does follow that all of space-time has a beginning, but it doesn't necessarily follow that there was nothing before that. What came before that would be could be some sort of quantum realm, or it could be a bounce, or there are other possibilities, right? They're discussing some of those here, but it doesn't follow that there can't have been something before that beginning. All it follows is that it wouldn't be anything. It couldn't be anything that was on average inflating over its entire existence, because then the theorem would apply to that. But if you have some quantum realm where this sort of space-time treatment doesn't apply, or if you have universes that are contracting, or steady state universes, then under these conditions, the theorem doesn't apply. So there are alternate models as well, even putting aside the interpretive issues. And what I would expect Craig to do is critique these models. That is, when Craig responds to this, I would expect him to critique these models, because he's done that in his published work. I won't really get into all that now unless that is discussed in this video. But that's my prediction, is that Craig is just going to present his standard objections to these models, which I think at a meta point is just kind of silly, because if your argument for a philosophical point is resting on particular, like taking a stand on particular highly controversial scientific points that even the experts can't agree on, then like how seriously should we take that argument, right? Like, it's not just taking a stand on the science, it's then they're then interpreting it in a specific way and then applying it to your argument. Like, originally the whole point, at least the way I read Craig's original writings about this, is that he back in, I think 78 is when he wrote the Kalam Cosmological argument, which was based on his thesis, right? Most of it was philosophical, and there was a little bit at the end where he talked about the Big Bang as providing kind of confirmatory evidence that the universe in fact did have a beginning. And insofar as it's just supposed to be like extra confirmation that it seems to fit with science, like I don't have too much of a problem with that. But since then, it's like morphed into the main part of the argument that science actually, and not just that it's kind of like confirmatory, but it's like science actually is really supporting and like doing the work here about establishing the universe had a finite beginning. And that's moved well beyond just like the Big Bang, and now is taking positions on quantum cosmology and these highly speculative models. And I can't take Craig seriously when he adopts these, when he claims to have this sort of insight into which of these models is correct, or what can or cannot be correct on the basis of basically purely physical arguments. Like Craig's already given us his metaphysical, philosophical arguments as to why the universe must be finite. But then, and apparently there's additionally all of these reasons that are purely found within quantum cosmology as to why you can reject certain models and why the contracting models don't work, the cyclic models don't work, the steady state models don't work, the quantum fluctuation models don't work. And I just find that extremely implausible kind of at the face of it. And then, of course, you can address the specific points that Craig makes, and that's perhaps better left for another video. But anyway, so that's kind of where we're at the moment, and that's how I expect Craig to respond to this, by just digging into more of the details here. So maybe we'll see if we can move to this. I think that maybe we're actually going to move to talking about the second law of thermodynamics in a little bit. So that is a bit of a change of pace.
The singularity or not, and I agree with that. I think that it really is something that will emerge in approximate sense in the semi-classical regime.
Generalized second law that was proven by Aaron Wall for a quantum singularity, it assumes an infinite space. And if you don't allow for infinities in your theory, then you cannot take that theorem seriously either.
Craig also quotes a paper by Anthony Aguirre and John Cahias that he claims closes the door to a past eternal quantum gravity era. But in most models, the quantum gravity era is brief anyway. And the paper only referred to a particular model known as the emergent universe.
But there are other possibilities too, as to how the universe could be in accord with the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, but could, I think, really be past eternal. If you define a past eternal model, you can. It self-consistently works, but you do have an edge to it. If you can ask what's beyond that edge, and it's another copy of the same universe. So I think where the debate lies, past eternal models exist. I think some of them are flawed, like the emergent model. I think you can't really make a self-consistent model that stands up. Past eternal inflation or the steady state model, I think you can, but you have to do it carefully. And there's an interesting then answer to what is this Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem pointing to? It's pointing to something very interesting. It's just not in initial time.
Just as there are theorems that...
So it's been at least a year since I delved into some of that quantum stuff for a video I did with Nathan. So I don't know when these interviews were recorded or exactly what's transpired in that space. What I would say is I remember looking at least some of the emergent universe models and some very recent papers, which did seem to me, granted as a non-expert, I do have graduate training in physics, but I'm certainly not a cosmologist. So like I think I know kind of enough to get the gist of the papers, but not enough to say like which is the right model or anything. Anyway, I found some papers, and maybe just go back to the video where I did on bad apologetics with Nathan, where we talked about the Kalam Cosmological argument. It's one of the earlier videos for more detail on this, because I don't remember all the specifics right now. But there I showed some papers that were still presenting alternate models of this. And basically, this is the attempt to have a some sort of quantum realm that exists for an infinite amount of time and then collapses to or there's some sort of collapse that then gives rise to a sort of a Big Bang event. I'm pretty sure that that's what they're referring to by the emergent universe, because there are a few different models. So I apologize if I got slightly muddled there. But the point is that some physicists will say they don't think this class of models work. And other physicists will say, well, actually, I think that this is just a problem that we need to tweak, and then we can propose a new mechanism and so forth. And this is sort of what you get in some of the papers, right? So again, I would say the appropriate response is just to say we don't really know at this point. I think there are interesting quantum models that that potentially can resolve some of the issues that Craig has. Because what Craig says about some of these quantum models is basically that you can't have an unstable quantum state that stays unstable like forever, that is for an infinite amount of time, and then collapses. Because if there was any probability of decay, then that would happen after an infinite amount of time. And this has been a problem in the literature. I kind of give an indicative way of thinking about this in my book, where I give the example of a case where you of the normal distribution, like the bell curve, right, where you can go halfway. If you go halfway up the distribution, you've traversed an infinite sort of range of numbers, because it's defined over like infinite numbers, but you've still only got to 50% probability. So the point of that is that if the probability of decay changes over time, then you can have an unstable state that persists for an infinite amount of time. You can't have it with a constant probability, but you can have it with a varying probability, as long as the probability varies in just the right ways. So that there are some papers that discuss this and show that, obviously it's speculative, right? We don't know that this is the case, but that there are ways potentially around this problem, or at least that appear plausible to me. And others may then publish and say, well, actually, there's this other problem. But this is how they develop, right? Again, I'm not saying that these models are true. I'm saying that I think they're interesting, and I don't think that we're settled on this. And what the debate is at the moment is a lot of issues. Like, all of the models have problems. I mean, obviously, otherwise we would just, there would be one that would be obviously superior to the others, right? And so physicists will criticize each other's models by, like the string theorists will criticize the loop quantum gravity, and the loop quantum gravity guys will criticize the string theorists, and the emergent guys will criticize the cyclic universe, and the cyclic universe will criticize the emergent guys. So, this is the sort of thing you have in the literature, right? But that doesn't mean that Craig's rejections of the models are justified, right? It just means that, from my perspective, he picks out the objections that people raise in literature and then uses that against all of the models, and then sort of implies that, well, we should reject all of the models and then just stick with those that Craig favors. Whereas I think that there's actually a lot of that many of these models are plausible, open possibilities, and that we just don't know, and we need to wait for the science to develop further.
Prove the universe had a beginning. There are also theorems that imply the opposite.
I think you can prove anything. Theorems are very strange things because you can have a theorem to prove anything as long as you assume the right things. In a way, that's the problem. And you can violate any theorem as long as you violate the assumptions.
Of course, there are the singularity theorems, but
yeah, that's a good point, and that's one of the reasons why physicists, I mean, they do use these sort of theorems like BGV for particular purposes, but they're just not as interested in theorems of this sort as Craig seems to be. Craig, he makes a big point about this being the theorem, like a proof, and a lot of physicists are just like, yeah, I mean, you can prove that with the right assumptions, and it's all a question about what are the right assumptions. It's just a different sort of attitude, which I think you see displayed there, and that's an important point to realize as well. And I think this comes back to the rhetoric as well, when Craig plays up rhetorically the point about there's that line he has where it's like, evidence is what it takes to convince a reasonable man, but a proof is what will convince even an unreasonable man, or something like that. He's got this quote that he uses, and these sorts of things that he says that really play up the point of it being a proof or a theorem, but when it doesn't really mean that much. Again, like BGV is an important result, and some of these other theorems are important results if appropriately understood and in the context of what they're showing, right? But I think that, yeah, Craig kind of misappropriates that in the way that he presents it in some of his popular debates, at least.
you can always interpret them as telling you that a quantum theory of gravity should not have one of the hypotheses that you are using to formulate this theorem.
The Big Bang doesn't prove the universe had a beginning, only that it evolved from a very hot, dense state. But when it comes to physics, the Kalam advocate has another card to play: the second law of thermodynamics. The second law states that entropy, which is roughly a measure of disorder, increases with time. And so the argument goes, if the universe were eternal into the past, we would already be in a maximal entropy state. Since we aren't, the universe can't be past eternal. This also related to the mystery of why the Big Bang was in a surprisingly low entropy state. But what if the universe were infinite?
Perhaps we're living in a physical system where there's no maximum possible entropy. Suppose the entropy can just grow forever. And an eternally inflating universe looks like such a system, although nobody really knows for sure how to define the entropy of an eternally inflating universe. But if it's the case that entropy can grow forever, then any state is a state of low entropy because it's low compared to the maximum, which is infinite.
What we need to consider is not just the entropy of matter, but also entropy associated with horizons, so to say, the gravitational entropy. In the contracting barrage, because the dynamics is different from Einstein's theory, a horizon develops, but it grows extremely rapidly. This entropy dominates completely the entropy of matter. Therefore, the entropy is really growing very rapidly, but then at the bounds, the geometry is such, which is not a trivial statement, is such that, in fact, the area of this horizon becomes infinite. And then after that, the horizon simply disappears. So if you like, what one has to do is to reset the entropy clock, in a certain sense, at the bounds.
These are just two of many potential solutions to this entropy problem, which are explained in our film series Before the Big Bang. The fact that there are several options tells us entropy does not prove a beginning.
Yeah, so the question as to why the entropy of the observable universe was so low at the early period of the universe is an open question in physics and cosmology. I think that it is, I've got to be careful what I say here. I'll just say I think that it's wrong to appeal to open scientific questions as support for particular like strong philosophical positions, such as that the universe must have had a beginning, especially when you're trying to use that as an argument for the existence of God. And I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but I think that it's the same thing with respect to other outstanding scientific questions, like the neural correlates of consciousness, for example, or the origin of life would be another one, or the fine-tuning of the universe, so apparent fine-tuning would be another one. These are all open scientific questions, which certain people want to settle or use them to settle particular philosophical arguments. Obviously, in this context that I'm appealing to them, all pointing to theism or used to point to theism or something like that. I just think that this is bad philosophy because the fact that we don't know something, the fact that we haven't arrived at certain knowledge through scientific means, I don't think entails anything about what that answer should be, or that the answer is a particular way, or that like there isn't an answer from a natural point of view, or whatever. I think you've got to go a lot beyond the mere absence of an answer to establish that. And to be fair, there are of course philosophers who try to do that for these different things that I mentioned. Well, I don't think really origin of life, but certainly like for fine tuning and for like qualia and consciousness and things like that. So the good philosophers will actually try to give you sort of philosophical reasons as to why we should accept something beyond the material. But I think that the bad way to argue it is to say that, well, science can't explain it, therefore, and I'll insert my preferred philosophical explanation here. And in this case, we're talking about the origin of, not the origin of the universe, but more specifically the fact that there was low entropy in the past. That is just an outstanding scientific problem. Craig doesn't have an answer to this, by the way, because I don't know why God likes there to be a low entropy universe. God could make a universe that started with whatever entropy he likes. So this is, of course, the problem with appealing to God as an explanation, that it doesn't explain anything because God could do whatever he wanted. So Craig doesn't have a better explanation, but he will present it as if he does by saying that, well, actually, the best explanation for the low entropy of the universe is that it was, began a finite time in the past and was created by God. What I would say, and I mean, just what the video said, there are many potential answers to this question. One of them is that there is no maximal entropy and that entropy is just continually increasing. Another possibility is that, in fact, the universe is in a steady state situation. I don't think this was mentioned, but it's at least has been discussed that the universe is actually in a maximal entropy state, and everything that we observe is effectively a fluctuation away from that. So the whole multiverse, if you like, is in a state of maximum entropy, and our observable universe is a tiny part of that, which represents a fluctuation away from that. Craig will give a Boltzmann brain objection to these type of arguments, by the way, which I won't try to explain here, but I'm predicting that he's going to go down that direction in responding to this, that we're going to hear about Boltzmann brains as part of his response. And so those were two. So there's no maximal. We are at the maximum. We're a fluctuation. Yet another one, which I think is what that gentleman at the end there was talking about, which I don't think I'm going to get this quite right because I don't understand it very well myself. But it's basically that we don't know very well how to describe the entropy of the curvature of space-time itself and how that evolves as the universe expands. I think that there are different approaches to how to do this. And essentially, if you have a contracting and then expanding and contracting again, like a cyclic model, then whether or not there's going to be entropy buildup over that cycle, I think depends on the way that you model the entropy of the curvature itself and how that's affected through the contraction process. I think that's what he was talking about with respect to he mentioned the horizons expanding or something. I apologize, that's a little vague because I'm not 100% clear on that myself. But the point is that there's at least three options there that I've just mentioned, right? About possible solutions to the entropy problem. And of course, maybe we just haven't come up with the correct solution yet. Craig, though, wants to say that he has the solution, and the solution is that the universe, like the whole universe, not just our observable universe, the whole multiverse or whatever, began a finite time in the past with a low entropy state. The issue there is that doesn't actually answer the question, because the question is, yeah, but why did it start with the low entropy state? It explains why it hasn't built up more entropy over time, right? Because there hasn't been enough time, but it doesn't explain why the entropy was low in the first place. So Craig's postulated answer it only answers, if you like, half of the question. It doesn't answer why the entropy was low to begin with. As far as you know, it could have been anything, at least given like standard, pre-quantum Big Bang models. To my knowledge, the entropy is just a boundary condition that you just put in, and theoretically it could be anything, that we just observed that it was low, and that entropy has been increasing over time with increasing disorder. So Craig doesn't have an answer to that, and he certainly doesn't have an answer to that when he invokes God, because I don't know why God likes a low entropy universe. I mean, I guess you could concoct reasons, but at this point, it just seems ad hoc to me, and better just to go with a different scientific theory. Anyway, so that is the point about entropy. Now it looks like we're going to talk about, I think, causation and the universe coming from nothing. So let's see where we get it from there.
What if the universe did have a beginning? In the 1970s, Edward Tryon claimed the universe might arise as a quantum fluctuation of the vacuum. But this still raises the question, where did the vacuum come from? In 1982, Alex Vilenkin suggested that if space itself was treated quantum mechanically, it could quantum tunnel into existence. He titled his proposal, Creation of Universes from Nothing.
Now, sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics...
I can't help myself commenting on this. Did you see the way that Craig used the word skeptic there? This is not an isolated point. Like this is a way that he uses the term, and you hear other apologists or popularizers of apologetics use the language of skeptics in this way, where it appears that it's used synonymously with like, well, I mean, it's kind of derogatory in the way that it's applied, but also the skeptic is really just someone who is not convinced by their arguments, it seems. But it's also kind of used synonymously with like atheist or scientific skeptic or whatever. I just think it's interesting, like discursively, how the notion of skepticism is used, or the skeptic. Whereas I think of the skeptic in general, like in positive terms, because I identify as a skeptic. I think skepticism is in general good. Of course, there are toxic forms of skepticism, but you can say that about anything pretty much. Yeah, but in these sort of discourses, the skeptic is always something that should be seen with a lot of, suspicion, and we want to defeat the skeptic. And anyway, I just think that that's sort of interesting how that sort of plays out. Fits with a bit if you watched my most recent video before this one, talking about how Cameron talks about doubt and linking that to anxiety. I feel like that this language of the skeptic is kind of bound up in that a bit in apologetic discourse. But anyway, that's kind of a side point. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, Nathan. The skeptic is an out group that's explicitly othered in the way that it's discussed, which is a problem because, like, everyone should be a skeptic, in my opinion, especially if you're doing philosophy. Anyway.
Subatomic particles, so-called virtual particles, come into being from nothing. This skeptical response represents, I believe, a deliberate abuse of science. The theories in question have to do with particles or the universes originating as a fluctuation of the energy contained in the vacuum. The vacuum in modern physics is not what laymen understand by vacuum, namely nothing. Rather, in physics, the vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. To tell laymen that on such theories something comes from nothing is a distortion of those theories. Properly understood, nothing does not mean just empty space. Nothing is the absence of anything whatsoever, even space itself. How silly then when popularizers say things like nothingness is unstable to quantum fluctuations, or the universe tunneled into being out of nothing.
When we say nothing in this.
Well, that's kind of ironic coming from Craig, who claims that the BGV theorem, in proving that inflationary universes are past incomplete, that actually entails that the universe, like that metaphysical time had an absolute beginning and finite time in the past. That's supreme irony there, because that's an absolute distortion and misrepresentation of the science. But anyway, with respect to this point about nothingness, I think that there is an equivocation there between, I guess, technical and popular usage. Again, it seems that Craig is being a bit selective in when he's concerned about that. But yeah, before I comment further, I think I'll just let this play a bit more.
This context, tunneling from nothing, we don't mean quantum vacuum. It's actually what Tryon meant. And here we have a state without space completely. So there's no vacuum.
But if the universe did quantum tunnel into existence, what caused it?
Many quantum mechanical processes do not require a cause. So for example, if you have a radioactive atom, you know that it will decay, but you cannot tell when. So there is a half-lifetime. For example, you can tell that in a year, the probability for this atom to decay is 50%. Then the year has passed, it didn't decay. The probability for it to decay the next year is still 50%. Eventually, it will decay. But if you ask why did it decay at that particular moment, there is no reason. There's no cause. So quantum mechanical processes like this are uncaused. And the spontaneous creation of the universe is of the same nature.
The notions of quantum mechanics place severe pressure on everyday ideas of causality. You might say, well, there are some interpretations of quantum mechanics that allow for causality and determinism, and it's true, there are, but then there are other interpretations that don't.
Since the Kalam asserts that everything that begins to exist has a cause, its defenders carry the burden of proof to show causality is maintained in quantum mechanics.
So the different interpretations of quantum mechanics do differ.
Sorry, I'm just sort of scrolling forward a bit to see where they're going so I can decide where to pause. This guy, though, that beard and hair, whoa, that is impressive. I cannot compete with that, sorry. But what was I saying? Yeah, so quantum mechanics. Yeah, so I already felt Craig wanting to say that it depends on your interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I see that we're moving in that direction. But just in terms of nothingness, yeah, so I would expect Craig to respond to this by reiterating the point about how nothing in physics is not nothing to the sort of layperson. And Craig likes to use the example that nothing is what rocks think about, like it's just non-existence, like true literal nothing. And obviously, well, I think it should be obvious that physicists don't have anything to say about that form of nothing. There's nothing to say about it, right? It's nothing. But the issue is that when Craig thinks about the universe coming into being from nothing, he's I think that it's fair to say this, thinking about creation ex nihilo, which is what he thinks happened, and I think the model that's in his mind, which is that literal form of nothing, and then there's a sort of a poof, which comes from the divine exercise of causal power or whatever, and then the universe, comes into being or whatever. Now, that's not the idea that physicists have. In fact, the way that physicists think about things fundamentally is just very different. What they're going to do is that they're going to model space-time, say, or they're going to model a quantum system, and then they're going to use a coordinate system to model that, and then they're going to use the various equations to describe its evolution over time and things like that, or evolution under different conditions, or calculate various aspects of it and try to predict half-lives and other things, and whether certain processes are plausible or not. The point I'm making with that is that there's just no real room for nothingness in the philosophical sense there. I mean, what can you say about nothingness in that sense? It just has no place, right? Physicists will start with things that we know about, such as space-time, or maybe like a quantum vacuum of some sort, which isn't nothing, as Craig points out, and then they'll model that. The question is, in terms of the relevance for the Kalam, can we explain the origin of like space-time in terms of processes outside of space-time? At least that's how I would phrase it. And I think the answer is plausibly yes, because well, at least some classes of these quantum cosmological models allow for processes that occur outside of space-time, or like I want to say prior to, but that's not really the right word, right? Because they don't stand in temporal relations to things in space-time. They're, I guess the way we would think about it is just sort of non-temporal. Although our intuitions break down here, it's very hard to discuss this. So Sean Carroll is, I know, a proponent of some such models. Interestingly, Inspiring Philosophy talks about these sorts of models when he talks about the idea of the holographic principle and related ideas of the fact that space and time are not fundamental, they emerge from underlying quantum processes. If this is true, then it fundamentally undermines the Kalam argument, right? Because you could have an origin of like classical space-time in terms of like general relativity, but not an origin of this sort of quantum space, whatever it is that we're going to, this quantum foam or this quantum quantum energy field or whatever, which gives rise to it. And that would exist outside of our conventional notions of time and space, and maybe even causality, although that's somewhat of another question. So the point is, it doesn't really matter whether the universe came from like, the relevant question is not, did the universe come from nothing? The question is there anything from which we can say the universe emerged that is itself outside of conventional space and time? If the answer is yes, then that puts a lot of pressure on Craig's argument that if the universe began to exist, then it had a cause, because these models don't necessarily operate under the laws of causation. Or even if they do, actually, then that puts pressure on the idea that the cause would have to have been God. Craig says that you can't have a physical cause give rise to the universe because the universe is just every physical thing that exists. And this is another example of him, I think, shifting the goalpost, because if you define the universe as all physical things that exist, then it's not, then the quantum models say that, well, actually, no, the universe may not have begun to exist at all. There may be part of the universe that is outside of space and time, and that didn't begin to exist. How could it, right? Because it's outside of time. On the other hand, if you define the universe in the way that I think is typically in cosmology, which is like sort of space-time or contiguous regions of space-time, then there may be physical states outside of the universe. That might sound crazy, but again, we just got to get our definition straight here. Physical might mean like some sort of quantum substrate. And the claim is that there may be some forms of quantum states which can exist without, or sans, as Craig likes to say, like classical space-time. And that's the sort of model that Sean Carroll believes, for example. If you sort of go back far enough, there was no space-time in the way we understand it, but there was still physical stuff around. So the point is that if you define the universe to be the way that cosmologists typically think, which is like space-time, then the fact that that had a cause, the fact that that is finite, it doesn't mean that all of material reality is. And even if the universe had a cause in that restricted way of thinking about it, it doesn't mean that all of material reality had a cause. Conversely, if you define the universe, as Craig tends to in other contexts, as just all physical things that exist, including whatever quantum stuff maybe exists outside of, the standard universe we think about, like space and time, then it may actually be just false that the universe began to exist, right? Because there may be an atemporal part of the universe. which then couldn't begin to exist because it's atemporal. So and this is actually how Craig thinks about God, right? Craig thinks that that God existed timelessly sans the universe, but then entered into temporal existence with the universe. So Craig thinks that in some sense God transcends the universe, and there's, I guess, an aspect of God, or I don't want to say part of God, that seems wrong, but that there's a mode of God's existence, let's say, that is atemporal. And it seems the physicalists potentially can say something similar, that there may be, at least as far as we know currently, parts of physical reality that can exist or did exist outside of space and time, that is, they're atemporal. And so Craig has an issue here that he needs to be careful about the way that he's defining universe and which conception is he giving. And that affects what responses can be given. But either way, I think it's problematic for Craig in terms of trying to establish either that the universe had a cause, and also that that cause must have been something outside of, like something that's non-material. Because under some conceptions, the universe could have had a cause, and that cause could have been material, as long as you define the universe in a certain way. But then there's the further question is, does it need a cause at all, regardless of how you define it? And this is a question of whether everything even does have a cause. And so that's then, I think, where we're moving into here.
A lot in terms of the role of causality. Start with the Bohm interpretation, or Bohmian mechanics, or the pilot wave theory. That is most like classical mechanics when it comes to causality. Causality is deterministic, and cause necessarily follows effect according to the law. A bit of a more of a...
So a clarification here, I think Sean Carroll has worked on multiple models. So one of the things that he works on is emergent models of space-time. And in these, that there is, these are definitely not eternal models, and these are models in which space-time is emergent from underlying quantum phenomena. So I don't think it's necessary to say that Carroll's only worked on one model of argument. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that.
Deviation from the classical approach to causality comes in collapse theories, dynamical collapse theories, or the GRW approach. And these theories have irreducible randomness in the way the world turns out. So an effect need not necessarily follow a cause. A given cause could lead to many effects with different probabilities of each one. And there would be nothing in the world that explains why one effect happens rather than another. Any of them could have done. It was just random. And so that weakens the link between cause and effect. Instead of being ironclad necessity, it's probability. The cause makes the effect more probable. And I think that's a big change to the role of causality. But there's a bigger change still, potentially, to the role of causality in the many worlds interpretation, or the Everett interpretation. People often call that a deterministic interpretation, that they say we have the quantum state of the universe, and deterministically there evolves a multiverse, a system of many parallel worlds. But there's an open question as to whether we should call that process causation, or we should call that causality. My own preferred approach to understanding many worlds has it that causality is a process that goes on within each individual world, but not outside or between them. So causation is an emergent process that emerges along with the individual worlds, but is entirely contained within them. And that is perhaps an even bigger change to the concept of causation, because it means it's non-fundamental. It's not part of the deep structure of reality. It's not a concept that's even really properly applicable at the level of the whole universe.
In the Copenhagen interpretation, things are acausal simply because it's kind of built in the nature of interpretation. You have a wave function describing your atom, and then the wave function collapses in the course of measurement, resulting in some of the outcome probabilistically. And there is no cause how you choose these things. In the case of many worlds, this wave function describes an ensemble of universes. And in different members of the ensemble in different universes, you get all possible outcomes of your measurement. Simply, you don't know which universe you are in. And which universe you end up in is also an acausal kind of process.
In defense of the argument's first premise, Craig makes use of de Broglie-Bohm theory, also known as pilot wave theory. And in defense of the argument's second premise, Craig makes use of neo-Lorentzianism. Now, at least amongst physicists, both de Broglie-Bohm theory and neo-Lorentzianism are considered to be fringe and disreputable. Therefore, although Craig might seem to be simply appealing to common sense or to mainstream science, Craig is actually appealing to theories that do not enjoy wide philosophical or scientific support.
I think one of the basic lessons you can learn from advanced science of any sort is that common sense and intuition only takes you.
I think we're going to need to jump back a little bit here, because they've jumped over a lot of stuff very quickly. So yeah, it's certainly the case that whether or not every event has a cause, for example, which is a principle that Craig sometimes appeals to, depending on when he's making the argument. Whether that's true depends on your interpretations of quantum mechanics, which I do not want to get into here, and I have discussed more in other videos. I don't want to get into too much here. I'm willing to get into it a little bit. But this part here, I'm going to have to watch again, because this breezed past me a bit too fast. Neo-Lorentzian relativity in the beginning of the universe. That sounds like an interesting book there, but anyway.
Also known as pilot wave theory. And in defense of the argument's second premise, Craig makes use of neo-Lorentzianism. Now, at least amongst physicists, both de Broglie-Bohm theory and neo-Lorentz.
Yeah, so this is the part where I was a bit... Okay, yeah, so this is from a paper which I've referenced before, which is one of the best pieces of evidence we have about the attitude of physicists and philosophers in the space about preferred interpretations of quantum mechanics. It's not a very good survey, but it's I think the best we have. And the fact that it, for example, says 0% on here doesn't mean no one defends them. It just means that none of the fairly small sample rated that as their preferred interpretation. Excuse me. If you look at the literature on this specifically, I think that you'll find that the main interpretations that will be discussed will be objective collapse theories, information-based or epistemic theories, which are sort of instrumentalist, at least that's how I understand them. Pilot wave theories, which is de Broglie-Bohm, that was what the scholar just mentioned. And then many worlds theories. So Copenhagen is not really... Copenhagen is like the orthodox view, which is, in my view, and the view of quite a few other philosophers who work in this space, it's not really an interpretation. It's incomplete and doesn't really explain how you get from a sort of a quantum world to a macro world. So the fact that you're getting a lot of preferring that, I would say, is just an indication that a lot of the people in this sample are not... I don't want to say they're not interested, because I think this was like a Foundations of Quantum Event conference, but it's like, I don't think that Copenhagen interpretation is defensible as a true like philosophical interpretation of quantum mechanics. The response that you'll often get from certainly certain physicists is just that we don't need anything, and quantum mechanics is fine as it is, and that's more the sort of attitude of the Copenhagen interpretation. But that's not really going to be very helpful to Craig, because the Copenhagen interpretation doesn't really say anything about causation in the way that sort of Craig thinks about it. And in terms of like the support for de Broglie-Bohm theory, it's certainly a minority view. I think that this is an unfair way to characterize it. It doesn't have 0% support. But honestly, pretty much all of these views are minority views because there's just no consensus here. So I don't entirely agree with this appeal here. Other than that, if Craig needs a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics to work in order for his argument to go ahead, then I think that that's really problematic for the argument. And this is kind of the meta point that I make in my book, by the way, which is that Craig needs so many particular things to work for the Kalam to go ahead. Like, he needs his philosophy of time. He needs his arguments about the impossibility of an actual infant to go ahead. He needs particular interpretations of general relativity to work out. He needs particular interpretations, apparently, of quantum mechanics to work out. Then he needs his positions on these different models of the origin of the universe. And also, then there's further questions about like how divine action works, which I don't even think we'll get into in this video, and free will and libertarianism and things like that. So I think that the Kalam is just too complicated for its own good, and there's too many positions that you need to take, each of which is individually risky. Put together, it's basically just very implausible that all sort of works out, and you can kind of deal with all of the issues. Anyway, and so this, I think, is a manifestation of just one issue there that Craig kind of needs. Really, he needs the de Broglie-Bohm theory, because if you sort of work through the theories, objective collapse theories they postulate inherent randomness, and that's not going to work with Craig's idea that like everything has a cause. I don't really know anything about modal interpretations. I won't comment there. Information-based and information theoretical views are generally epistemic views, so they don't really say anything about causation per se. In fact, some of them I think identify it specifically in terms of an agent's beliefs and how that, like, they identify wave function collapse with how an agent's beliefs adjust or should adjust over time, and that really. That doesn't really say anything about sort of underlying ontology or causation, I would argue. So that's not going to help Craig. Everett or many worlds views, again, it's not entirely clear how causation fits into those, because in some sense, all possible outcomes occur, and that's not really consistent with the classical notion of causation, that it sort of determines which of different possibilities pertain, which I think was what the gentleman just before or after this was making the point, that causation doesn't quite work the same way in many worlds models. De Broglie-Bohm is a deterministic model, so that one would support Craig's idea that like quantum events have to have causes. Copenhagen doesn't really say anything about it. I don't really know too much about consistent histories. I don't really understand. I've read a little bit about it, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I can't comment there. But the point is, most of these views here do not support Craig. It's just de Broglie-Bohm that would sort of support this idea that quantum events have a cause. And that's only one of many views. It's not 0%, right? But it's certainly not a majority. So I think that point is quite correct there. But Craig seems to need to I mean, Craig appeals to de Broglie sometimes in order to defend this idea that, well, actually, it's not a fact that quantum events don't have a cause, right? Which he's correct. I don't think you can just say that that's a fact because it's unclear. But it's certainly not a fact that they do, right? If anything, I think that we should lean against the idea that quantum events have a cause, because most of the interpretations that are favored don't say that. And so I don't think it's enough for Craig to just sort of gesture at de Broglie as if that's sort of a get out of jail free card. He kind of needs to embrace that, I think, or some other similar interpretation in order to save this idea that quantum events need causes. Because if quantum events don't need causes, then a quantum event could have been the quantum event itself could have been like a fluctuation that brought the universe into being, which itself had no cause. And if that's possible, then Craig's whole argument doesn't work, right? The universe could have begun, but just without a cause. It was just a quantum fluctuation that didn't have a cause, and then the rest of it's history, so to speak. So I don't think I think that Craig's response here is going to be to talk a bit more about de Broglie or perhaps criticize some of the other interpretations. But I don't know. I'm not convinced that he's going to really address the issue of that he actually has to kind of defend a deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, it seems to me, in order to get out the principle that if the universe began, then it must have had a cause.
Brownianism are considered to be fringe and disreputable. Therefore, although Craig might seem to be simply appealing to common sense or to mainstream science, Craig is actually appealing to theories that do not enjoy wide philosophical or scientific support.
I think one of the basic lessons you can learn from an advanced science of any sort is that common sense and intuition only takes you so far, and beyond a certain point, you really can't trust it. Russell once made the argument that since physics is really a systematization of our common sense approach to the world, his argument was, well, if common sense is true, then physics is true. And if physics is true, then common sense is false. Therefore, common sense is false.
If something could come from nothing, then why does this happen all the time?
I was going to say, so Craig has his stock arguments as to why the universe must have had a cause if it began to exist. And this is one of them, right, that he brings up. So I feel like that's the response that he would give to what that gentleman just said about common sense. So let's see what the video says about that.
Why don't tigers just appear in our living room?
Quantum mechanics, many things are possible that are not possible in classical physics. And indeed, you can have, in principle, you can have very strange things happening, like objects coming out of thin air. A lump of matter, in principle, it can turn into a tiger. And quantum mechanics will not tell you that this is absolutely impossible, but if you try to calculate the probability of this happening, it will be pretty low. If you think of the quantum creation of the universe, it is a tiny microscopic universe, right, that has to pop out of nothing. If you calculate the probability of this happening, I should say that conceptually this probability, interpreting this probability is a little difficult, but still, if you do the calculation, you find that it is far more probable than having a tiger materialize in front of you.
The argument that something can't come from nothing, or perhaps it would be better to say something won't ever come into existence following nothing, isn't really confirmed by our everyday experience, because in our everyday experience, we don't ever experience a nothing and check it to see whether something can or can't come from it. So there's no argument at all, I think, on the basis of what we've observed in everyday life at all, to think that something can't come from nothing.
It isn't just quantum mechanics that divides thinkers about the nature of causality. Philosophers are equally unsure of its merits.
So causation is a...
Yeah, so Craig, I mean, I know pretty much exactly what Craig's going to say about the whole issue about coming from nothing. So he has three arguments as to why the universe must have had a cause if it began to exist. So one of them is that our everyday experience confirms that like things have causes. But I mean, as was pointed out, I don't think that that's a good argument, because the beginnings of the universe is certainly not anything close to being within the realm of our experience. But Craig has two other arguments. So one of them is he says that it's a basic metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. I can almost guarantee that he's going to say something very much like that in his response. Now, I'm not sure what he means by basic metaphysical principle, because I don't know that there are any such things in philosophy. I mean, maybe Craig thinks it is, but that seems to be a bit question begging, right? I mean, is it a basic metaphysical principle? That's the whole point, right? So what's the argument that again, something coming from nothing is, as I've mentioned, as I've discussed in other videos, is just very misleading language, because no one thinks that, right? The question is whether the universe would have needed a cause. And Craig says that it must, because things have causes. And well, that's just question begging, right? Like, do they? We've just seen that actually the majority of interpretations of quantum mechanics don't agree that that's the case, at least about quantum events. And I personally suspect that causality in the way that we understand it is, in the way that we typically understand it, kind of only emerges at a macroscopic scale, and probably doesn't make sense, certainly like at a quantum gravity sort of scale, but that's just my personal view there. Anyway, so yeah, so I don't think that argument about basic metaphysical principle really works, but Craig uses it anyway. The last argument that he gives is this idea of if universes can come from nothing, then why can't anything come from nothing? Why don't we see tigers popping into being, and Beethoven and root beer and all sorts of other things, right? And often he puts this to good rhetorical effect if this is deployed in a live debate format, right? Now, I think that this is a terrible argument, but I still expect Craig to raise it here. So in response to what I think that was Valenkin was saying about the probability of, like, you can calculate the probability of tigers appearing, and it's not zero in, according to quantum mechanics, although it's far lower than universes appearing. So I wonder if the Boltzmann brain objection might come into issue here as well, because there are some issues about sort of how you do these calculations, and Craig uses Boltzmann brains as an objection against some of these kind of observer effects. That is the idea as well. What's the probability of a disembodied observer just sort of popping into being and sort of hallucinating that it exists in this larger universe? And there's certain models seem to imply that we would all be Boltzmann brains, like probabilistically, which well, so many people think is a problem. So perhaps that would come up here, but that's somewhat of a separate point, but it's sort of relevant. But the other issue is that yeah, I just think that he's going to double down on that and say, look, that doesn't have any bearing on the question as to why don't we see these things happen, right? If universes can come into being from nothing, or a universe can come into being from nothing, then we should see other things coming from nothing. I just think that he's not going to be that interested in sort of the probability of it. He would say, well, we never see it happen, right? So it sort of, and even conceptually, it doesn't make sense. I think that what Craig misses here is that the claim is that there may be certain types of events that don't require causes. Quantum events or decays and such may be one such class of events. Another may be very particular types of processes that are possible only at the very beginning of the universe, or like the atemporal part of material existence, or some sort of quantum realm from which the universe came. So perhaps those sorts of events don't require causes, whereas, certainly we know that tigers and root beer and Beethoven require causes, right? Like, we know what those sort of things are, and they need causes. So the fact that there are, basically Craig's argument amounts to the fact that because certain types of events are known to require causes, that therefore all events must require causes. And that's just question begging. Like, the question is, do this certain class of events, namely universe beginning events or event, does that require a cause? And it's just not established that it does by referencing completely different types of events, like the fact that, well, yeah, tigers need causes and root beer does. Does it mean that everything requires a cause? I expect that is what Craig is going to appeal to, but I just think it's a terrible argument, and it's hard to even see what appeal Craig thinks that it has. I guess he just finds it really intuitive, but it just seems to be like even Steelmanning, it's just a really weak argument from induction, like, because some things do that, therefore everything does, even when obviously they're very different types of things. Anyway, so that's the coming from nothing point. Now I think we're talking more generally about causation. So we'll see where we go there. This is actually a point that I've become more interested in later. More interested in lately, rather, the sort of metaphysics of causation and how to understand that. Craig doesn't say a lot about this, at least from what I've read. In particular, when he talks about universe having a cause, he doesn't say a whole lot about what he means by a cause. What I've actually argued in some of my recent videos is that Craig kind of has to redefine, or not redefine, but at least have a very particular conception of causation in mind for it to even make sense for the universe to have a cause, because typical notions of causation, not universal, but at least typical notions of causation, say that causation is a relation between events. And if that's true, then the first event cannot have a cause, like, just by definition, because there's no prior than event for it to be related to. So Craig obviously then can't appeal to that sort of causation. It's got to be some different type of causation. And specifically, Craig appeals to substance event causation, which is the substance of God causing the event of the universe coming into being, or something like that. Craig can do that, of course, but then the question is, well, why should we admit that type of causation? Do we think that there is any such thing as substance event causation, or why think that it works the way that Craig says? So that there's even further issues that Craig has to address here. He can't just help himself to the notion of causation without doing a bit more work in terms of the metaphysics of what he's actually talking about. And I guess maybe we'll see that discussed here. I'm not sure.
Classic philosophical topic in the sense that there's no agreement about it at all, and there hasn't been ever.
There's lots of schools of thought about what causality is. At the one extreme, we've got a view like that of Russell, which you might call the eliminativist theory of causation, according to which really there isn't any such thing as causality. Russell said, if you look at the physics, certainly the physics of his day, and I think it's plausible to say about physics today as well, it consists of equations, for instance, differential equations, and these relate states of a system at various times or at the same time, but they don't mention causal relations at all. And Russell's view was that the more developed a science is, the less appeal there is to causality in it. At the other extreme, or at least some way towards the other extreme, you've got views like the counterfactual theory, which says that A causes B means that if A hadn't happened, then B wouldn't have happened. But there are complications with trying to work out what exactly what's called the counterfactual, is supposed to mean, and that might in turn appeal to causality. So it may not even be a full account of causality at all. Or even further along the line, you might have a full-blown sufficiency account of causation, according to which A causes B means that A somehow makes or forces B to happen. And in between these extremes, there are all kinds of different theories. So it's a bit implausible if you assume, as the Kalam argument does, that whatever begins to exist must have a cause on the basis of our intuitive conception of what causality is. The intuitive conception of causality is vague, and it covers a whole range of different things, and you really have to be clear about which one you mean more precisely before that argument can be given any force.
If the universe had a beginning, it's hard to see how it could have a cause. After all, we tend to think of causes happening before their effects. But if time began with the universe, then there was no before. So how could God have caused it?
And I frankly just don't understand why people think that causality
caused it. But if time began, after all, we tend to think of causes happening before their effects. But if time began with the universe, then there was no before. So how could God have caused it?
And I frankly.
Oh yeah, so this is the point about simultaneous causation. So the idea is that the cause of the universe must have been simultaneous with the beginning of the universe. I personally don't think that this is really where the crux of the issue lies. I would say that the issue is more metaphysical than in terms of the temporal ordering, right? So obviously, if there was a cause, then it must be simultaneous. It must exist simultaneously with the event that is the beginning of the universe. But the issue is the metaphysical status of that cause, right? So it doesn't seem like it can be another event unless you think that there can be two simultaneous events, one of which is the cause of the other. Maybe that can happen later on, but particularly when one of those events then is the first event, which is itself uncaused, that doesn't seem to work, right? Because the whole idea is that you want a cause of the first event. So the point is that then the cause in the relata there of the cause and effect, right? The cause must be something that's not an event, or at least not a spatiotemporal event, like. But I think it's got to even be no type of event at all, because then it would, according to Craig's philosophical arguments, it would still need to have a cause, because there would then be the question of, well, why did that event happen, right? You've got to keep going further backward. Craig's idea is that it terminates in a substance, that is an immaterial substance of God, and him who exercises his creative power which itself, so the causal action is actually the direct cause, right? And that sort of occurs simultaneously with the beginning of the universe. But God as a substance is the ultimate cause of that exercise of power. So that's what Craig's going to say in response to this, and that the cause exercise of power is simultaneous with the effect that is the beginning of the universe. But my critique is that the metaphysical foundation of this is unclear, because that you have to then countenance substance event causation, which is, I think, problematic. It's not clear that that's an appropriate account of causation. I mean, maybe, but Craig then needs to defend that. And then the thing is, if we can countenance substance event causation, then why does the substance have to be God? Couldn't the substance be any type of other, literally anything that just has the sufficient causal power to bring about a particular quantum fluctuation, which then triggers the origin of the universe, right? It's not clear why we have to invent to like an immaterial personal soul, which is what Craig wants to. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later in the video, but I think that there are deep issues here that Craig just doesn't address very well. With respect to the metaphysics of the causation and how it's all supposed to work. He can maybe tell a story that works, but the question is, it's not enough just to have a story told. The question is, how plausible is this story? Because if the story is not very plausible or well motivated, then it just seems ad hoc just to get the argument to work, right? Because I can just easily say, look, I don't think causation works that way. So if your theory implies that the universe must have been caused in this very specific way that requires me to think causes work this way, then I'm just going to reject your theory. And I don't think Craig is has considered this sufficiently, or at least written sufficiently on this.
Frankly, just don't understand why people think that causality is a temporal relationship. For example, philosophers talk all the time about cases of simultaneous causation, where the cause and effect occur at the same moment of time. Immanuel Kant gave the example of a heavy ball resting on a pillow, causing a depression in the pillow. Now, the ball and the pillow could have existed from eternity past.
This seems like the admission of something that's existed for a past eternity. So it may be that Craig, by using this example, is allowing, and he may not consistently be able to allow, that something's existed for a past eternity.
In physics literature, there is no such thing as simultaneous causation. So the notion of causality in physics always has a chronological nature, that basically the cause should precede the effect. And in this particular example of the ball and the pillow, if you just look at things as they are at one instance, then you cannot really make any statement about causality. But if you look at the history of what preceded what, basically you put the ball somewhere, and then its effect propagates with the speed of sound through the medium, and the pillow basically accordingly reacts to that.
It's quite unclear what it means to say that one thing causes another if you lose the sort of context of space, time, and the laws of nature. And one very obvious reason for this is that many accounts of causation either explicitly or implicitly make reference to the laws of nature. Many of them also make reference to time. For instance, Hume's own definition of causation was that the cause must precede the effect in time and must be next to it in space, or there must be a chain of adjoining events in space. So we really can't make any sense of what it means for something to be a cause of another thing without time or space, any more than we can make sense of what it means for something to have a color or to have a shape or a size outside of notions like time and space. The notion of causality doesn't have the kind of purity of a notion, let's say, like number or logical notions, which do make this sort of extra-spatial, extra-temporal sense. And for that reason, to posit a cause of the universe that's outside of space and time, as the Kalam argument must, if it's going to prove anything like the divinity that people like Craig would want it to prove, seems to be stretching the notion of causality far beyond any of its uses that we can actually comprehend.
I mean, some concepts only make sense when applied within the universe or within some part of the universe. I mean, if you ask how much something costs, some table or some chair, then that makes perfect sense and there's a good answer. If you ask how much the universe costs, that doesn't really make sense because you can't step outside the universe to buy it. It could be very similar with cause and effect. Cause and effect is something that operates inside the universe. So it just doesn't make sense to step outside the universe and ask what causes it. Cause and effect is something that happens within the universe, not to it.
We've seen that many.
So my prediction is that Craig's going to react quite negatively towards those particular like snippets there that we just saw. And he's going to say something along the lines that they're making some sort of scientific or positivistic assumptions that the proponent of the Kalam is not required to accept. He's probably going to talk about the notion of substance dualism, or even if he doesn't use that by name, the idea that God is a substance that is able to, using libertarian agency, bring about effects that are outside of space and time. And I expect him to give examples relating to this idea of God just sort of counting down and deciding, oh, I'm going to create the universe now, which he sometimes does to illustrate the point about God can just sort of choose to do something whenever he sort of wants to, or whenever he exercises his volition. Yeah, I think Craig would respond by saying that the fact that the fact that causation may operate differently, he probably wouldn't say it quite this way, but the fact that causation may operate differently doesn't mean that it's not causation, right? So he would probably say that he says things like gratuitous assumption or something along those lines, that causation requires space and time. I'm predicting that he's going to say something along those lines, and then talk about his ideas of how causation works. And he's going to talk about substance event causation and relate that to then libertarian agency. Now, I've already expressed some concerns about that, in particular that even if he can give an account that makes sense of it all, it's not clear that we should accept any of that account. Because if the Kalam requires that account, then that's just an extra premise that we're inserting into the Kalam, right? That this crazy account of causation and how it all fits together is like the correct one. If it's not, well, then it just doesn't work, right? For example, if causation is always a relation between events, then Kalam doesn't work, right? God is not an event, so he can't be the ultimate cause of the universe if causation is only event. Under that notion of causation, I don't think the universe could have a cause. And as I said, I think that's quite a plausible live option there. And some of the philosophers that we just saw, they didn't express it in quite those terms, but they were saying similar things that I've been saying here. Yeah, so I think that that's a fundamental issue here, and I don't think Craig's going to really address that properly. He's going to present it as if the fact that he can say things about causation that makes sense from his point of view means that he's addressed the issue, when it actually doesn't address the issue. Just because you can come up with a theory doesn't mean it's plausible. And there's still further issues there about trying to make sense of libertarian agency. I think that if you think that the universe needs a cause, then it's plausible to say that God's exercise of his volition also requires a cause, because God's exercising his volition seems to be an event. And if you think that all events have a cause, then that should have a cause as well. So what is the cause of God exercising his volition? And if you actually read what Craig said about this, again, I discuss this more in my book, what he says is that God as a substance doesn't actually cause the universe, because then the universe would exist co-eternally with God. No, what God has to do is exercise his volition. God exercising his volition with the intention to bring about the universe is what actually causes the universe, right? Not God's simpliciter, but God exercising his volition. Obviously, God having the power to do that. And so the issue there is that God exercising his volition seems to be an event, right? So that resolves the issue about, event causation, right? But then the question is, well, what caused God exercising his volition? And Craig says that basically just doesn't need to have an answer, because libertarian causation is just kind of special. Special, I think, is my word, not his, but I believe that's the substance of what Craig says there. He basically, in my view, makes arguments, ad hoc arguments as to why this kind of libertarian exercising of volition doesn't play by the same rules that causation otherwise does. So, in other words, if I were to say, look, Craig, there was just a first event that didn't have a cause, and that's all there is to it. He would say, oh, that's silly. That's absurd, right? Think about, you're going to have unicorns appearing out of nothing and all of this, and it's a basic metaphysical principle. But then if I ask Craig, well, look, Craig, in your metaphysics, you've got this event where God exercises his volition to bring about the universe. And what's the cause of that? And Craig just says, well, that doesn't need to be a cause of God exercising his volition. I mean, that's just how it sort of works with substance dualism and libertarian agency. I mean, that's what we've always said, right? It doesn't need a further cause. That's just the agent exercises their volition. That's kind of all there is, right? So this is what Craig says, right? I'm simplifying a little bit there, but if you look at this when I quoted in my book, I think that that's actually a fair representation. Craig just thinks that it plays by different rules. If you are carried away with his, if you agree with his intuitions there and you sort of accept his account, then you're going to find that satisfactory. And I think that that's what he's going to hammer home in his response to this. If, like me, you find that to be kind of ad hoc and not very satisfactory, it seems like that he's kind of just introduced a get out of jail free card for his explanations to why it doesn't play by the same rules as other types of causation, then you're not going to find that persuasive. So I don't know that the argument actually sort of gets us anywhere in terms of changing people's minds there. But anyway, so yeah, I predict that that's going to be that particular segment there's going to be a sore point for him. So we'll see. We'll see if my prediction is correct there, and if he addresses some of the points that I just mentioned there. So we're almost finished. Just a few minutes left. A little more about causation, it seems, before we finish up here.
Many cosmologists favor a bouncing cosmology, which may be eternal into the past. Others favor a universe that had a beginning from a spontaneous fluctuation. Another class of models suggests that solutions to Einstein's equations that allow time travel into the past, known as closed time-like curves, could enable the universe to create itself.
This is clearly impossible. For in order to create itself, the universe would have to already exist. It would have to exist before it existed, which is a self-contradiction.
It may be inconsistent for Craig to say that, on the one hand, causes do not have to precede their effects in time, but then on the other hand, dismissing the idea of a self-created universe on the basis that a self-created universe would have to precede itself in time.
So a self-creating universe may appear to be a contradiction if you imagine a linear direction of time, because if you have some cause that leads to our universe, then that cause should precede the effect. But if you have a circular time, then there is really no notion of cause and effect, and because of that, there is no contradiction, because basically all you have is a consistency condition between what happens at one era and what happens at a prior era or future era, because they all just lead to each other. And as long as those consistencies hold, there is no contradiction.
You might have the whole closed time-like curve, and at that level, causality is not an appropriate concept. But if you focus on individual segments of the curve, you might have unidirectional cause and effect just restricted to that particular segment. And so we're right to think in terms of causality at the local level. When we zoom out, causality as such ceases to apply. We can still do physics. The fact that our intuitive understanding of cause and effect ceases to apply at the global level doesn't stop us writing down equations that would describe that system.
In order to assert the universe must have been created by an agent with free will, Craig uses an argument from the medieval philosopher Al-Ghazali, which asserts the universe must have arisen spontaneously, and the only example of spontaneous action is that of a free agent, something we supposedly know from our everyday experience of the world.
I mean, I think it's a pretty good argument. It's just that the premises we no longer tend to accept. The modern conception of the world, the standard view of quantum physics.
That's a strange thing for a philosopher to say, that it's a good argument, but we don't think the premises are true. I don't know. Maybe that's I wouldn't. I guess you could say that it's a valid argument, but yeah, anyway.
Is that it's not deterministic after all, that most interpretations of quantum mechanics have some indeterminism in them. And the most popular approach to understanding free action tends to be compatibilist. It sees free action as compatible with the laws of physics, indeed enabled by the action of the laws of physics. So Al-Ghazali's argument was pretty good, given the assumptions he was making. It's just that I don't think we now have any reason to accept those assumptions.
If you're in the game of appealing to everyday observations, then there's all kinds of things you can say that would be unhelpful to the Kalam argument. For instance, we observe that every event has been preceded by another event, but clearly the Kalam argument can't allow for that. We observe that everything that comes into existence has a material cause if it has a cause at all. But again, the Kalam argument can't allow for that. We observe that all agency, for instance, all intelligent agency, is material. But again, the Kalam argument can't allow for such things. So everyday experience furnishes all kinds of generalizations that are inconsistent with the conclusion of the Kalam argument. And it's just arbitrary to choose the generalizations that you like from everyday experience and ignore the ones that don't fit with your conclusion.
To summarize, the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yeah, so just before the summary there, yeah, so this idea about the so we sort of had the closed loop models of time, and then libertarian agency. I don't quite know why those were put next to each other. I feel like that loop time stuff should have been about half an hour ago, but never mind. So a quick note on that. So I expect Craig to say that those models are speculative, and honestly, I don't think that those models, I think they're quite interesting, right? But I don't think that they should be a worry to Craig. But the reason why they shouldn't worry Craig is also a reason why he can't use the Borda-Lincoln theorem, right? Because Craig thinks that time is has a particular structure, that it's essentially a distinct metaphysical process or phenomenon in which you have the objective coming into being and then elapsing out of being of moments of present, right? A series of events. You can't have circular time on that idea. It's just completely incoherent. Once an event has moved out from being present and gone into moved into the past, then it's gone. It can't sort of come back again. That just doesn't make sense under this idea. So I think just metaphysically, Craig is committed to a view of time that just doesn't allow for this sort of circularity, and so he has metaphysical reasons for rejecting that. But I expect that he'll probably also say that it's speculative and we don't have evidence for it and other things like that. He likes to, obviously, someone could criticize me for being unfair here, but I would claim that Craig likes to say that scientific theories are speculative when he disagrees with them, but not really mention that when he appeals to speculative theories. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think that what those theories of circular time establish is that what Craig describes as impossible are not known to be impossible. Craig largely, I think, appeals to sort of intuitions here about establishing, well, it just sort of doesn't make sense, right? So I wouldn't defend those circular causality views or circular notions of time as, like, I don't think that that's what time probably is like, but I think it's a possibility, which we haven't been able to rule out. So I don't think they're the best way to argue against Craig, though. I think there are much better arguments to use. Now, to the question of libertarian agency, I think I've already said what I wanted to say about this earlier, which is basically that Craig, I think, just basically defines libertarian agency in a way that gets him around the problem that he's sort of painted himself into about how the universe needs a cause, but it can't be another event. And so, but it also has to be an event, because otherwise, if it's a substance event causation, then he claims that the universe should be co-eternal with the eternal substance cause. So then he has to basically just make libertarian agency work in a way where it's substance event causation, but in a way where it's okay, and the effect won't be co-eternal with the cause, because God is eternal, right? But the universe isn't. So that's sort of Craig's way out of this, and I expect that that's what he'll articulate further in his response. My criticism is that this all just seems ad hoc. And I don't know why we should accept any of it. And it seems just as plausible and indeed simpler to say that, well, maybe there was an event that didn't have a cause, instead of there wasn't, but then there was, and it's a substance, and then you have this special volition type of causation, which allows you to have a cause, but then there's no further cause of that because that's allowed. I just don't see how that's a better explanation. Yeah, and so the point about appealing to, that was the other last point, the point about appealing to everyday intuition or experience. So Craig, I think, Craig would claim that everyday experience supports all of his conclusions. I can't remember what he has to say about the idea that all our everyday experience shows that all events have a material cause. I think what he's going to say is that our everyday experience actually shows that's not true, because he thinks that our everyday experience shows that we are immaterial substances. So if he responds specifically to that point, he's probably going to point to that and say, no, our everyday intuitions actually show that not all events have a material cause, and then point to our volitions of choosing to do things which don't have a material cause. Likewise for other alleged counterexamples, which I kind of agree with, by the way, but Craig would claim that I think our intuitions, all our sort of everyday observations or intuitions are consistent with his arguments. I think Craig, across the board, relies far too much on his own intuitions about things like infinity and like causation, time, and other matters, like self and souls and so forth would be another example. This seems to fit in with the idea, with the fact that he came to Christianity through non-rational means. That's not me casting aspersions. He's very clear on that himself, and that the arguments are kind of additional justification that comes after the fact, but isn't necessary. I think that actually he plausibly, this is my inference here, he may well think about some of his other philosophical arguments like this as well, that the intuitions come first and are sort of primary, and then the arguments are sort of developed on top of those. I don't think that he said that right, but it would seem consistent with the way that he approaches Christianity, at least, and seems to fit with the way he develops his arguments, which at base, many of them are based on sort of very intuitive notions about infinity and about time and about like personhood and about causation and these other issues. And I think that that's maybe a good place to sort of end out on, because fundamentally I reject that approach to philosophy. I think that our intuitions can be a good starting point for asking questions and thinking about possibilities, but they aren't really evidence, certainly not like definitive evidence for any of these issues that far exceed any of our observations, like the nature of the self or the nature of time and the origins of the universe and the ultimate ground of causation and all of these sorts of things. I have no idea why we would expect our intuitive ideas to really map much to anything. And this is generally what I think physicists sort of think as well, as you've sort of seen in this video. And many philosophers agree, although certainly not all philosophers. But Craig, at least in my opinion, goes further than most philosophers these days will in terms of making these sort of appeals to intuition. But appeals to intuition is what actually grounds most of the Kalam, right? If you think about the first premise that everything that begins to exist had a cause, ultimately that is reliant on Craig's intuition that he hopes you share about things not popping into being out of nothing. That's at the ground of it, right? And then the second premise about the universe began to exist. Ultimately, that's putting the science aside, which Craig doesn't think is necessary, right? He thinks the philosophical arguments really get you there by itself. Those philosophical arguments are based on intuitions about infinity, as well as sort of combining with the intuitions about time that we talked about as well. And then with respect to establishing the nature of the cause, that the cause has to be this immaterial mind. Well, those are based on intuitions about the notion of like substance, the fact of substance dualism with respect to humans and immaterial minds, and then that type of volitional causation that we talked about as well. I think if you press these arguments, you get an appeal to, like, a very strong appeal to intuitions. Now, that's not unique to these arguments, right? Other philosophical arguments can appeal to those as well, but I would say that it's particularly pronounced in this case. At least that's my reading of it. So let me just play the last little bit here, and then I think we'll finish up.
Argument is based on an outdated view of mathematics and an outdated view of physics. Mathematicians don't deny infinity, and physicists no longer believe the Big Bang is the beginning. The argument assumes our everyday experience of causality must hold true, even when there is no space or time, but then claims an immaterial mind made the universe from nothing, which is completely contrary to our everyday experience. In short, the Kalam cosmological argument is unsound.
Yeah, so just with respect to that last part, I think that Craig's going to say that causation outside of space and time, or at least sort of separately from it, is part of our experience, because of his appeal to sort of volitional causation and free will and things like that. Anyway, so I think that's all I want to say. So what I've done here is provided my commentary on the video and also my responses, sort of my addendum to responses to Craig's arguments, and my predictions about how Craig will respond. And honestly, the predictions, they're not even really predictions, because they're just based on things that Craig's already written and said before. So in general, I predict that Craig's going to say that this video is not good, and either misrepresents him or fails to, how does he phrase things? Fails to address things that he's discussed already in the literature. And he's going to claim that he's responded to every objection that's made in this video in the literature. And to be fair, he has responded to some of them. Although, as I've pointed out, some of the issues, for example, the issue about his particular preferred interpretations of or his preferred ideas of causation, as well as his the issue about whether the future can be infinite or not. Those are issues that he has sort of addressed before, but I don't actually think he's sort of really grappled with the crux of the issue. I think he sort of talked around it. So I expect sort of to see more of that. Now, I think that the issue with this video that I would, I think it's a good video, but I would raise two concerns. One is that I feel like parts of it lacked sufficient context for a popular audience. Obviously, this is not, this is not like high school level science. This is an appeal to a lot of sort of cutting edge stuff, even in philosophy, but also in physics as well. So I expect it to be a bit more advanced, right? But there were times when, I felt like I really need to pause and give a bit of explanation about, particularly when we started talking about relativity, that I felt came a bit quick. Maybe they wanted to get the whole thing under an hour, given that it's like 59 minutes. But I feel like it could have done with another 10 or 15 minutes of just a bit of context, maybe from a narrator and maybe with some visualizations to clarify some points on like relativity and things. So that would be one point that I would make. The other point is just that I think it leaves, I think the video as a whole leaves too many open avenues for Craig's response based on things that he's written in the literature before. I don't know that this is necessarily a fair critique because Craig's written so much, right? But at the same time, I feel like if I had an hour to do a video responding to Craig, specifically about the Kalam, I don't want to say I could do a better job, like in terms of the whole video, like, because, we've got great production value and everything like that. But I just mean in terms of things that I would include in terms of what he said and the responses and the open issues there. I think I would have structured the coverage differently, such that to try to leave fewer avenues for sort of escape for Craig. I mean, it's not a form of entrapment, right? But the point is to try to get him to really address the key issue here that we think needs to be addressed. And I think that in a number of points here, that there's plenty of space for Craig to deliver his sort of standard responses and not kind of address at least what I see, and certainly what some of these physicists as well see as sort of the key issues here. And I think I tried to identify those as we went through in terms of some of the philosophical issues as well as the issues with interpreting the physics. And one major omission is no discussion of Craig's philosophy of time and how it conflicts with his interpretations of, or his appeal to the results of science and relativity. Now, this doesn't surprise me because it almost never gets discussed, but I discuss it in my book. So if you're more interested, you can look at that there. But also, I think it's just a major problem for Craig. Craig thinks that presentism is needed for the Kalam to work, certainly for his version of the Kalam. Presentism, I think, just flatly contradict. It just cannot. I don't think you can be a realist about presentism and a realist about the interpret the scientific findings of cosmology and quantum mechanics literally. I think that they're just inconsistent with each other. And that's a major problem for Craig with respect to any of the scientific arguments. But there's further problems because I think that Craig's arguments against the possibility of an actual infinite also contradict with presentism. I won't get into that here. That's a whole other discussion, but it would have been nice to see that appeal to as well, because I think that the whole Kalam collapses under the fact that Craig cannot give a interpretation. In my opinion, Craig cannot give an interpretation of a philosophy of time that allows him to affirm that the universe, that the past cannot be infinite, and also fits with his intuitions about coming into being and objective temporal becoming and things like that. I don't think it works. But you can see some other videos where I talked about this to get more detail about that. So yeah, I think this was a good video. Unfortunately, I think that there's enough avenues for escape that what we're going to see is a series of refutations from Craig and maybe others popularizing that as well. And what he's going to basically claim is that he's responded to all of these in his published work. These are bad criticisms, and that, maybe he won't say this explicitly, but people are going to take this as further confirmation that the Kalam is a really great argument. So I guess that's a sort of a pessimistic take, even though, as I said, I do think this is a good video and a good introduction to some of the issues. But yeah, so if you guys have thoughts, I'd love to see your reactions in the comments, and particularly be interesting to see whether my predictions come true when we get all four of Craig's responses. Maybe I'll do another video then after that those will come out and respond to some of those, as well as I expect we're probably going to see more responses over time as the discourse sort of washes out with respect to this video. But it was good to see such a well-made production, really bringing in the experts and sort of addressing Craig explicitly about the arguments that he's made in more depth, which is good. I think that this video is going to appeal to like scientifically minded people, and particularly atheists, not necessarily exclusively, but like people who are more coming at it from the science point of view are going to find this quite persuasive. People who are more persuaded by philosophical arguments, particularly Craig's intuitive appeals and the sort of more Christian metaphysics behind it, I don't think we'll find this persuasive, because a lot of the science here I think will go over their heads and will just not be very persuasive. And there was a lack of context, I think, as well to really try to hammer that home in some places. Anyway, so I'm not sure how helpful it will be in terms of moving the dialogue forward, but I guess that's pretty hard. That's a pretty high bar to set anyway. I'm not sure how well my own videos succeed in that. Yeah, so hopefully you found this interesting. Feel free to leave some thoughts in the comments, and thanks very much, everyone. I'll talk to you soon. Take care, and bye.